Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 1 of our story. If you like this What If story and want to see part 2, let me know in the comments below. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Also, check the description for more great content and my playlist. This story was posted by Napping Ghost on Wattpad. Now let's start. It was a cold night in Mizudafu, and the streetlights cast a dim glow over the empty streets. To the untrained eye, it seemed as if the city was deserted, but a few civilians were out, perhaps returning home from a late night at the bar or visiting friends. If they looked a little closer, they would realize that the city was just as alive at night as it was during the day. During the day, people bustled about, confident in the protection of the heroes who kept them safe. They admired these heroes, unaware that true danger lurked in the shadows after dark. The night was a time when clever villains emerged, hiding their identities as they plotted in alleyways and warehouses. Deals were made, thieves operated, and underground heroes waited for the perfect moment to strike against their foes. The night was full of secrets, and one could never truly know what lay hidden in the darkness. Midoriya Izuku, also known as Kaizen, Mizudafu's 𝐼𝐚𝐧𝐟𝐢𝐜 Vigilante, was not one of those villains or heroes. At 15 years old, he found himself being pursued by 3 underground heroes in a dark alley. His life had taken unexpected turns, and he often wondered how different things might have been if he had made different choices. He had seen visions of many possible futures, some where he became a hero, others where he turned villainous, and even some where he was a singer or a ghost from the past. The vision that impacted him the most was from when he was 6 years old, the day he met All Might. Unlike in his visions, he had not asked the question that could have changed everything. He reflected on how a single question could alter the course of one's life. He understood the story of the quirkless boy who received a powerful quirk from the symbol of peace. That Izuku was destined for greatness, but he was not that Izuku. He had watched countless visions and recognized things he disliked in both their worlds and his own. It was time for his story to be told. Waking up to the sound of his alarm at 6:25 was something he despised. Groaning, he fumbled for his phone and finally silenced the alarm, sinking back into sleep until he remembered he had school. Reluctantly, he sat up and headed to the bathroom. After a quick shower, he replaced some old bandages and attempted to tame his unruly hair, ultimately giving up. He dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where he ate leftovers that were older than he cared to admit. As he checked the time on his phone, he realized the electricity had been out for weeks, though at least the water was still running. With a sigh, he gathered his things for school and slipped on his shoes. However, when he opened the door, he was met by the landlord, who was clearly waiting for him. Taking a deep breath, he put on his best cheerful expression and greeted Mr. Yamamoto. The landlord glared and gestured to the door, prompting Izuku to turn and see the bright yellow notice plastered on it. Second eviction notice. He had expected it, but it still hit him hard, a painful reminder that his mother had truly abandoned him. She had never been a part of his life, and he couldn't even remember the last time he had seen her. As he stood there, lost in thought, Mr. Yamamoto cleared his throat, snapping him back to reality. He grabbed the notice and stuffed it into his school bag, turning back to the landlord. The man inquired about his mother's whereabouts, and Izuku bitterly thought that he had no idea where she was. However, he maintained his innocent facade, explaining that she had taken on more hours at the hospital and was difficult to reach. Mr. Yamamoto seemed to accept his story and let him go, reminding him to inform his mother about the eviction notice and that they needed to vacate by Saturday. Once the landlord was gone, Izuku hurried to school, already late for first period. As he sat in the principal's office at 𝐼𝐬𝐃 High School, he couldn't shake the feeling that being late was never better than arriving on time, despite what people said. The principal addressed him sternly, asking if he knew why he was there. Izuku was not present in the first period that morning. He considered the 10 colorful paint bombs he had placed around the school but dismissed the thought, confident that the faculty wouldn't find them. The principal, a tall man with a greasy appearance and an arrogant demeanor, glared at him. He accused Izuku of cheating on his recent first-semester exams, leaving Izuku in disbelief. How could this be? He had studied diligently for all his grades, even going so far as to intentionally get a few answers wrong on homework to avoid suspicion. He attended every class, took notes, and remained quiet. What could he have possibly done to deserve such an accusation? As Izuku's anger boiled, he noticed the color drain from the principal's face. He felt his facade slipping, revealing a more assertive side of himself. He quickly regained his composure and requested the first-year final exams, reminding the principal that any school must provide this test upon request. If he passed, he could be excluded from the current year's classes, having already mastered the material. The principal, still shaken from Izuku's outburst, nodded in understanding. With a mischievous grin, Izuku left the school, leaving behind a trail of colorful paint splatters and astonished teachers. The principal was left to deal with the aftermath, but that was no concern of Izuku's. As he slipped through the school gates, a newfound sense of freedom washed over him. He wondered why he hadn't done this sooner. Remembering that he had run out of energy drinks after another sleepless night, he sighed and headed to the convenience store he frequented. It might be on the shadier side of Mizudafu, but it offered decent pre-made food. Without electricity, he relied on ready-to-eat meals and snacks like protein bars and jelly packets, which he didn't mind since they tasted good. Upon entering the small store, he was greeted by the familiar buzz of flickering lights and the jingle of the doorbell. The elderly woman behind the counter recognized him immediately. She asked if he was back for more energy drinks, gently reminding him to get more sleep. He smiled sheepishly, feeling a bit embarrassed. He had been visiting this store long before he started his vigilante activities a year ago, and the woman had become aware of his habits. She chuckled at his embarrassment, and he laughed nervously as he made his way to the back area to grab drinks. He picked up about 15 energy drinks, along with some snacks and a hot, ready-made ramen. He ensured he had enough to last him for 3 days before heading to the checkout. After paying and thanking the woman, he left the store. Surprisingly, he made it back to his apartment without any trouble. Once inside, he slipped on his house slippers and headed to the kitchen. After grabbing his ramen, he settled at his study to enjoy his meal in peace. Just as he began to savor the noodles, a notification popped up on his phone, interrupting his moment of tranquility. He sighed, realizing he wouldn't get to eat in peace after all. Upon reading the notification, he muttered to himself about another tough case for the detective he enjoyed teasing. He logged into his computer, the screen illuminating the dimly lit room as the moonlight seeped through the window. He had perhaps inserted a small code into Mizudafu's police database, but that was beside the point. His favorite detective was going to work himself into the ground with this case, and Izuku couldn't let that happen. Who else would he annoy? Eraserhead. He chuckled at the thought of Eraserhead's reaction if he thought he had caught him, only for Izuku to slip away effortlessly. With that thought in mind, he opened the classified document and put on his headset, confirming that it was online and functioning. He sighed, ready for another all-nighter, and wondered if he could lend a hand. Meanwhile, 𝐒𝐬 sat in his office, staring at his computer screen with exhaustion that rivaled Eraserhead's. He sighed, glancing at the empty coffee cups from his previous all-night. Just then, Sansa appeared in the doorway, looking at him with pity. 𝐒𝐬 waved him off casually, grimacing at the thought of yet another long night ahead. The detective reassured himself that he would solve the case and then finally get some much-needed sleep. Although it didn't completely ease Sansa's worries, he remained silent. Suddenly, a modified voice, familiar to both of them, came from the computer, startling them. The voice announced its presence with enthusiasm, eager to assist. The detective took a moment to regain his composure, feeling a mix of annoyance and amusement at the vigilante's antics. Kaizen laughed, teasing Sansa about the detective's tendency to overwork himself. The vigilante's playful tone was evident as he assured Sansa that he often came to the detective's rescue. The detective shot a glare at Sansa, who seemed to enjoy the exchange, but Sansa only grinned back, clearly entertained. Kaizen continued to express his readiness to gather evidence while the detective would handle the legal paperwork to expedite the process. The detective sighed, realizing that arguing with the vigilante was futile. They had a case to solve. Hours later, at 2:23 a.m., they completed the case in record time. The detective couldn't help but admire Kaizen's intelligence. He had always known the Vigilante was clever, but this was impressive. He silently hoped that Kaizen and Nezu would never meet, fearing the chaos they could unleash together. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. As the detective processed their success, he suddenly froze, his face paling as papers scattered around his desk. A long silence followed, marking the first time anyone, including pro-heroes, had heard Kaizen's voice without the voice changer. The revelation shocked him. Kaizen was just a kid. In a moment of panic, Kaizen realized his voice changer had glitched. He sat in silence, contemplating how to proceed. After a brief pause, he decided it wasn't a big deal for the detective to know his age. He had been considering giving the police a hint about his identity, especially since they had little information on the infamous Vigilante. The detective's voice broke through Kaizen's thoughts, sounding distant as he processed the revelation. Kaizen stifled a laugh, amused by the detective's disbelief. The detective expressed his shock, incredulous that a child had been outsmarting a whole station of trained officers. Kaizen couldn't hold back his laughter, finding the situation hilariously absurd. The detective, caught in a moment of crisis, urged Kaizen to take the situation seriously. However, Kaizen continued to chuckle, realizing he needed to end the conversation before the detective tried to talk him out of his vigilante activities. Just then, a notification appeared on his phone, providing the perfect excuse to escape. He smirked, announcing that he was needed elsewhere before abruptly ending the conversation. Once he hung up, Kaizen surveyed his study, only to find 3 empty energy drink cans. He sighed, acknowledging his habit. Cleaning up his mess, he noted the time, 3:06 a.m., and rubbed his temple, muttering to himself about having problems. He decided to take a quick bath before bed, hoping for a rare night of uninterrupted sleep. Lately, his requests and missions had been overwhelming. About 4 months ago, he had started a project that was, technically speaking, illegal. He created an online platform where people could reach out for help, often in desperate situations. He had assisted individuals escaping abusive relationships, helping them relocate while he dealt with their abusers. Many victims hesitated to contact the police, fearing they wouldn't be supported. Kaizen had taken on more of these requests than he cared to admit, believing he was doing the right thing. After a refreshing shower, he returned to his computer, where 3 new notifications awaited him. The first 2 requests were straightforward. One involved a kidnapped girl, and the other was about clearing a false record. But the last request piqued his interest, stating that people said he helped anyone in need. Regardless of status or background, there was a hope that the truth would emerge. Shoto, along with Natsuo, expressed a need for assistance with a case that was supposedly closed. Shoto sought help to investigate the case of his older brother, Tuya Todoroki. When he was 12, his brother had been declared dead due to a forest fire accident. However, Shoto was not convinced. He recalled seeing someone else in the forest that day, a detail he had shared with his father, who dismissed it as a result of his grief. Years later, as an adult, Shoto brought this information to his family, who believed him and shared his concerns. He pleaded for someone to help put his family's minds at ease. With a mischievous grin, a detective named Neo Mesa felt a thrill at the request. He loved cold cases and recalled the excitement of a previous prank he had pulled on the Hero Commission's main office. 3 months earlier, Neo Mesa was having an unexpectedly easy day at his office. He had time to grab coffee and was relieved by the lack of paperwork. However, a sudden call interrupted his calm. After hanging up, he took a deep breath, only to be interrupted by his colleague, Sansa, who burst through the door with wide eyes, eager to share news about Kaizen's latest antics. Neo Mesa sighed, wondering where Kaizen had even acquired a flamethrower. Meanwhile, Kaizen, hidden somewhere in the Hero Commission's vents, sneezed and pondered who might be discussing him, assuming it was just Endeavor complaining again. Izuku, after reading the Todoroki family's mission request, struggled to contain his excitement, knowing he needed rest to avoid exhaustion. He recalled the challenges of controlling his quirk when he first received it at 9, which had caused him trauma during those years. After securing his computer, he fell asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow. Shota Aizawa, known for his understanding nature, found himself increasingly annoyed with the newly formed heroes in the underground. He remembered his own struggles when starting out but felt their actions were illogical. After finishing his patrol, he longed for rest, only to be interrupted by a barrage of messages on his phone. Among them were frantic texts from Detective Tsukauchi and 2 messages from Nezu, indicating that critical information had been leaked regarding the ongoing case involving the Vigilante Kaizen. Aizawa felt a sense of dread about the upcoming staff meeting, knowing it would likely bring more complications. Naomasa rushed to the chief's office, knowing he needed to share crucial information regarding the Kaizen case. Upon entering, he faced his superior, Chief Kenji Tsurugamiya, who questioned why Naomasa wasn't working on the case. Naomasa swallowed hard, then explained that Kaizen had once again assisted him with a case. The chief nodded, observing the situation with curiosity. The kid was known for assisting the station, particularly with challenging cases. Feeling my resolve wavering, I decided to share my thoughts. I mentioned that Kaizen's voice changer had glitched and that he was likely between the ages of 12, and a heavy silence followed, and I began to feel anxious. Had I made a mistake by revealing this information? What if the kid didn't appreciate me informing the higher-ups? I worried he might withdraw from me, just as he had months ago. Even worse, what if the Hero Commission discovered his true age? The thought made me uneasy. I couldn't allow them to get their hands on him. Who knew what they would do? The Commission's Young Hero program had always raised suspicions. Before I could delve deeper into my thoughts, I caught the chief's gaze. He appeared to be deep in thought, engaged in an internal debate. His eyes flickered to a picture of his children on his desk. Taking a deep breath, he looked me straight in the eyes and expressed his longing to keep this new information about Kaizen from the public and, under no circumstances, from the Hero Safety Commission. I stared at him in disbelief, but his serious expression left no room for argument. He shared that he didn't want the commission to get their hands on the spirited kid either. He acknowledged Kaizen's intelligence and resourcefulness, warning that the committee's reaction could be unpredictable. We certainly didn't want a repeat of the Hawks situation. I was surprised by his request to keep this under wraps, but I had no intention of arguing. I agreed and he nodded, contemplating something further. He suggested that involving 𝐒𝐮𝐬 could be beneficial, but emphasized that Nezu would need to ensure the commission remained unaware due to the teachers under his supervision. I thought that was a good idea and resolved to speak with Nezu, knowing he would appreciate being informed, especially since he had shown interest in the kid. As I prepared to leave, I felt a scowl forming on my face. I had a lot of work ahead of me. Just as I reached the door, the chief reminded me to have a good social worker on file for when we hopefully convinced the kid to accept help. I froze mid-step, surprised he had known. He simply smiled, explaining that anyone with a keen eye could see I had suspected Kaizen was a kid long before this revelation. He mentioned that Nezu had also suspected it, but I had called dibs on adoption since I had my suspicions first. A sigh of relief escaped me. I hadn't realized how tense I had been. I asked if it had been that obvious, and he chuckled in response. With that, I exited the office, a newfound determination surging within me. I was resolved to help this kid. Before closing the door, I expressed my gratitude to the chief. Once back in my office, I took a deep breath and stared at my phone, lost in thought. I needed to inform Nezu, whom Kaizen referred to as the Rat God. After a moment of contemplation, I grabbed my phone and dialed Nezu's personal number before I could second-guess myself. The phone rang 3 times before he answered, his tone curious about the urgency of my call. Realizing it was 3:32 a.m., I cleared my throat and apologized for the early hour, emphasizing the urgency of the matter. Nezu's interest piqued, and I explained that it involved the ongoing Vigilante case. The line fell silent as he processed the information. I confirmed that it was about Kaizen and mentioned a new development regarding his age. I insisted that a meeting with 𝐒𝐮𝐬 was necessary, emphasizing that the Hero Safety Commission could not learn of this meeting. I could almost envision the excitement on Nezu's face as he laughed, finding the situation entertaining. After regaining his composure, he expressed his gratitude for involving 𝐒𝐮𝐬 in this matter and began planning the details. We settled on a meeting for 1 p.m. that day. I jotted down the time, agreeing that it sounded perfect. Nezu assured me that all his staff would be present. After concluding the call, I took another deep breath and glanced at the time again. The call had lasted about 20 minutes, and it was now 4:31 a.m., too late to sleep and too early to wake up. I sighed, feeling a sense of sympathy for 𝐒𝐬, who managed 20 kids daily. It was a bit easier now that he had expelled a couple, but I wondered how he handled it all, especially with a kid like my Vigilante. Speaking of which, I pondered what Kaizen might be doing at that moment, hoping it wasn't anything too reckless. Meanwhile, Izuku woke from a nightmare, his head spinning and drenched in sweat. His breaths were rushed and deep, and the darkness of his room felt cold. Once he realized it had only been a dream, he began to calm down, focusing on regulating his breathing. After about 10 minutes, the protagonist felt almost back to normal, though a hint of panic lingered. They grabbed their phone from the desk and checked the time. 7. A little more than 4 hours had passed, neither good nor bad. Usually, when nightmares occurred, they were simply visions. These typically came during the day, but on rare nights when stress or fatigue built up, focus faltered, allowing visions to slip through the cracks, costing precious sleep. Rising from bed, the protagonist changed out of their sweat-soaked clothes. Opening the closet, they spotted their Vigilante mask and hood, seemingly glowing in the light filtering through the open window. Deciding to do some parkour to shake off the restlessness, they felt a sudden chill in the air. A breath escaped their lips, visible in the coolness surrounding them. The energy from their quirk gathered near their eyes, signaling another vision. In an instant, everything turned white, and they found themselves standing in a detective's office. The detective rushed out the door, and the protagonist followed, entering the chief's office. Confusion washed over them. They usually saw worlds similar to their own in visions, but lately, their own world had become more frequent in these glimpses. Listening to the detective and chief, the protagonist initially felt bored as they discussed the revelation of their age. Contemplating whether to sift through police paperwork to avoid sneaking in later, they thought about gathering information. In these visions, they could move freely, using computers and going through papers without being seen or heard. They could even walk through people who would flicker as if nothing had happened. Years of practice had allowed the protagonist to master their quirk, preventing them from losing their sanity. Just as they turned to explore the police department's paperwork, a comment from the chief made them pause. The chief expressed a longing to keep new information about Kaizen from the public and the Hero Commission. The protagonist stared in disbelief. Why would he do that? Turning to the detective, who had endured more headaches and gray hairs due to their antics, they noticed he looked just as surprised. The detective expressed concern about the commission getting involved with the spunky kid, acknowledging that Kaizen was a smart but slippery individual. The protagonist nodded in agreement. If the commission got involved, it could spell trouble. The detective quickly agreed with the chief, suggesting that involving 𝐒𝐮𝐬 would require guarantees from Nezu to keep the commission uninformed. The protagonist was utterly flabbergasted. Why were they helping? As the detective prepared to leave, the protagonist contemplated deactivating their quirk. They were a vigilante, after all, and the authorities were supposed to catch them. But then, the detective's next words stunned them into silence. The detective mentioned the need for a good social worker for when they hopefully convinced Kaizen to accept help. The protagonist froze, realizing the implications. Did Tsukauchi really want to take them in? Before they could finish that thought, the detective confirmed that anyone with keen observation could see the suspicion surrounding Kaizen's true identity. The protagonist felt like a deer caught in headlights. The detective had suspected all along. As the vision faded, the protagonist lost focus, causing their quirk to deactivate. They fell to the floor, staring at the plain white ceiling of their bedroom, both impressed and concerned. The detective had seen past their serious demeanor, recognizing the mischief that emerged over time. They had never spoken face to face, only observing from a distance or communicating through hacked communications during missions. The detective likely believed they lacked access to proper medical care, assuming they were just a kid without resources. Thankfully, that wasn't the case anymore. Rising from the cold floor, the protagonist returned to their closet, reaching to the back until their fingers brushed against the wall. With practiced ease, They found a fingerprint scanner they had installed months ago. Placing their hand on it, the device beeped to life, granting access to their hidden sanctuary. The back of the closet collapsed, revealing their secret hideout. The area wasn't large or extravagant, but it was mine, and I took immense pride in it. With the pocket money I received from those I subdued, I had found a way to invest in my interests. To the left stood a small table dedicated to my experiments and weapon crafting. I created smoke bombs, RBB bullets, tranquilizer darts, glitter bombs, paint bombs, and my personal favorite, paintballs. Each item was neatly displayed on the right wall of the room. Although my experiment area was a bit cluttered at the moment, I planned to organize it later. I walked over to the 2 lockers positioned in the middle of the room. Placing my thumb on the fingerprint padlock, similar to the one at the back of my closet, I heard it click open. As I began to put on my suit, my thoughts drifted to the vision I had experienced. If the detective had figured something out, who else might have as well? The thought sent a mix of nervousness and excitement through me, fueling my anticipation for the challenge ahead. I grinned as I secured my last smoke bomb in its holder, contemplating how I would handle anyone who dared to uncover my identity. I was determined to keep things interesting for my opponents. The detective had mentioned informing you, about the detail I had accidentally revealed earlier, which likely meant a meeting was on the horizon. I approached my computer, pondering the timing of it all. Did they not realize it was rude to discuss someone without inviting them? I decided I would drop by for a quick visit. 𝐒𝐬 perspective shifted as he entered the police station the next morning. If he had to describe the scene in one word, it would be chaos, complete and utter chaos. Sansa stood beside Officer Tanuma's desk, his hand extended as if waiting for something. Moments later, Tanuma slammed a thick stack of yen into Sansa's hand, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. Sansa merely snickered, shaking his head as he walked away, reminding Tanuma of his earlier warning. 𝐒𝐬 scanned the room, noticing Gory with his hands on his head, looking pale. Sighing, he made his way through the doors, which closed behind him with an audible click. Every officer in the room turned to face him, and he knew it was going to be one of those days. Gory was the first to voice his disbelief, lamenting how a single kid could solve more cases than most officers combined. He appeared to be experiencing a whirlwind of emotions, ultimately slamming his forehead onto his desk. Sansa, clearly seeking to explain the situation, informed 𝐒𝐬 that the chief had called a meeting regarding the new information about Kaizen, now dubbed the Vigilante. 𝐒𝐬 nodded, deciding to set aside the nickname for later. Most officers in the station admired the Vigilante, and learning about his young age only heightened their admiration and concern. 𝐒𝐬 felt guilty for his worry, having barely slept the previous night as he contemplated the dangerous feats the kid had accomplished, from hacking government facilities to rescuing lost pets and taking down drag lords. He had resorted to a sleep aid tea, managing to get 7 hours of rest, which he considered a victory, even if it meant waking up at 11 a.m. and rushing to the office for the necessary paperwork for the meeting at U. As he retrieved the documents, he noticed his coworkers had mostly accepted the news. Gory looked as though he had aged significantly, mumbling about early retirement plans. Just as 𝐒𝐬 was about to leave, Officer Kanyashiki popped his head out from a doorway, sharing that they had received a tip about Kaizen planning to take down a major kidnapping organization in broad daylight. 𝐒𝐬's breath hitched, and a new level of panic washed over him. The thought of Kaizen facing such danger alone was overwhelming. He began pacing, his coworkers watching him with concern and understanding. Turning on his comm, he hoped Kaizen would hack into it as he often did. Kaizen took a deep breath, analyzing the 21 men below him. Perched on a metal beam about 25 feet above the ground in an old, abandoned warehouse on the city's shady side, he realized the mission regarding the kidnappers was part of a much larger organization than he had anticipated. After learning about the meeting Nezu had planned with the detective at 1 p.m., he found himself in the dark, musty warehouse. Most of the members were asleep, making them easy targets, but that felt too simple. Just then, the door slammed open, revealing the boss, the very person Kaizen had come to confront. With a grin, he landed in front of the leader, ready to get things underway, eager to make the most of the situation. His fist was coated with venom, a result of his quirk, Rattle. Some of the venom dripped onto the concrete floor, immediately beginning to corrode the surface. He made a mental note to avoid the yellow venom in the future. As the leader approached, he jumped back, only to realize too late that the second-in-command was behind him. The villain's stinger quirk struck, and he felt a sharp pain as the stinger embedded itself in his side. Gritting his teeth, he felt the warmth of BLD trickle down. Annoyed, he activated his own quirk, not at full power to avoid losing consciousness, but enough to see quick predictions of what might happen next. He exhaled, watching his breath materialize in front of him as the familiar coldness of his quirk spread throughout his body. Power coursed through his veins, and despite the pain, he grinned. Looking up at the villain who had injured him, he noticed the man's expression change as realization dawned on him. Time seemed to slow as he locked eyes with the villain boss. He grabbed the stinger still lodged in his side and pulled it out slowly, maintaining his grin. Some of the lower-level criminals looked on in terror and disgust. The villain began to back away but froze as his disoriented voice echoed through the building, declaring. It was his turn. The area around him began to frost over as he moved swiftly, kicking the back of the villain's knees to bring him down to his level. He leaned in close to the villain's ear, stating that he was bored, and then slammed the back of the man's head hard against the concrete. BLD stained the floor beneath him. The second-in-command met a similar fate. He turned to face the criminals, taking a deep breath to calm himself. He asked if they wanted to make things harder than necessary. Wisely, they chose to surrender. Once they were secured with police-grade quirk erasing HNDCFFS, he glared at them. He mentioned that he had taken care of their little issue. For a moment they stood there, shocked. One of the criminals managed to stammer out a question. He looked at them with an incredulous expression, then huffed in amusement, feeling slightly offended that they thought he wouldn't find out about the villains who had been blackmailing them for years. He pointed to the two unconscious villains nearby, noting that they had threatened to harm their loved ones. One of the criminals spoke up, expressing concern that the operation was not solely run by those two and that someone else would still have control over them. He looked at the man with a mix of respect and bitterness, then pulled a picture from one of his pockets and tossed it on the ground for everyone to see. Without waiting for a response, he confirmed that he was right. The picture showed a beaten man, and he recalled the nasty individual he had dealt with just moments before entering the building. Leaning against a crate in the warehouse, he closed his eyes after calling the police. He opened them again when he heard sobbing. Looking up, he saw some criminals crying while others were full-on sobbing. Turning his back to them, he declared that they had been forced into this situation, but he had cut them free and helped them this time. He warned them that if they ever crossed him, he would hunt them down himself. Using his parkour skills, he made his way to the roof, trying to ignore the pain with each movement. Just as he was about to leave, he heard shouts from below, expressing gratitude. They called out that if he ever needed anything, they would be there for him. One even exclaimed how terrifying he still was, which brought a slight smile to his face. After a few more shouts of thanks, he left the building, checking the time as soon as he was far enough away. It read 11:20 p.m. Ignoring the sharp pain in his side, he continued to hop from rooftop to rooftop, keeping to the shadows and alleys to remain out of sight. His next destination was high. He glanced at the device on his left arm, a small screen that had taken him 7 months to create, allowing him to hack from almost anywhere. As he scrolled through interesting information, a notification popped up on the screen. Initially thinking it was a glitch, he rebooted the program, but the message remained. It was odd that the detective usually had his comm closed at this time. He quickly hacked into the detective's comm, easily bypassing the lack of additional defenses. Once connected, he greeted the detective, who sighed in relief. The detective had received a tip earlier that morning about him taking down a kidnapping ring alone and wanted to know if it was true. He grinned and turned off his voice changer, confirming that the tip was correct and that he had just taken them down moments ago. He sent the detective a complete report, including the location. The detective's tone turned serious as he asked if Kaizen had been hurt. He snorted, reminding the detective that he couldn't lie to him. Laughing, he admitted that he may have been stabbed by a 2-inch stinger. But the detective's worry caught me off guard. He insisted on knowing my location, urging me to get to the hospital. He asked how much it hurt on a scale from 1 to 10 and if I had lost a lot of BLD. I reassured him that I was fine, playfully calling him Dadtective, which made me laugh, though it seemed to silence him. I swallowed hard, trying to excuse myself, but pain shot up my side, and I couldn't help but yelp. I quickly ended our contact, but taking a deep breath turned out to be a mistake. My injury flared with pain, and the world around me began to spin. As I looked around, a terrible headache hit me, and I realized my ears were ringing. Bringing a hand to my side, I discovered I was bleeding more than I had anticipated. Panic set in. I was losing too much BLD. I managed to grab some emergency supplies from my suit and took a sip of water, realizing that energy drinks weren't helping. I needed to see a doctor, and it should only take a few minutes. Half an hour later, I learned it hadn't been a quick visit. The villain had cracked one of my ribs, and my movements had nearly caused it to puncture a lung. The doctor scolded me, but at least it wasn't as bad as the last time. He fixed me up quickly with the help of his quirk. He warned me not to engage in any of my usual antics and tossed a bottle of painkillers at me before ushering me out. I liked the doctor. He reminded me of a grumpy but caring grandfather I never had. True to my nature, I didn't follow his advice. 𝐒𝐬 felt a wave of worry, panic, and fear when his quirk confirmed that his kid, had been stabbed. He rubbed his face as he paced in his office. The moment he registered what I had said, warmth blossomed in his chest. He had gone silent for a moment, and when he finally realized how long it had been, I had already ended the connection. Alone in his office, he took a deep breath and rushed out, papers in hand along with a steaming cup of coffee. He knew he wouldn't be sleeping that night after the scare, but he couldn't just sit around while I was out there alone. He got into his car, heading for 𝐒𝐮𝐬, knowing he needed to meet with Nezu, who would be crucial in convincing me to accept help. But finding me would be the real challenge. The doctor had warned me not to engage in any activities I usually would, especially after just having healing done on my lung and ribs. But I was determined to attend that meeting. So there I was, standing on a large light fixture above 𝐒𝐮𝐬's conference room, trying to keep my composure. The meeting included all of 𝐒𝐮𝐬's staff, and even Eraserhead, looking exhausted with a large cup of coffee in hand, was present. I arrived late, pausing to manage my injuries still healing. My confusion grew when I heard Nezu's laughter echoing through the room while the detective glared at him. Nezu expressed his longing to have me as his personal student, impressed by my mind and eager to start a proper course. Before I could process the situation, the detective firmly rejected the idea. Nezu questioned his authority to make that decision, stating it should be mine and my guardian's. The detective remained unfazed, asserting that I lacked a proper legal guardian and that he intended to provide me with a home. Nezu suggested that I become a ward of 𝐒𝐮𝐬, offering protection from the enemies I had likely made through my vigilante activities. Hearing that made me grimace. There was no way I would allow that. Just as I considered intervening, Nezu continued, suggesting we didn't even know if I had a guardian or not, implying I wouldn't choose the detective. That was the last straw. I activated my voice changer and declared that I didn't have a legal guardian, especially now that my mother was exposed for her actions. My voice rang through the large room, demanding their attention. All the professionals jumped up and took defensive positions, except for one detective who froze the moment Kaizen spoke. His first words confirmed Kaizen's decision about what to do next. He recognized Kaizen and expressed his surprise. Kaizen smiled as he turned off his voice changer and acknowledged him. He then addressed Nezu, stating that he would only say this once. Kaizen pointed out that despite Nezu being the smartest being in Japan, he had failed to realize that the grumpy detective was the only person Kaizen would accept as his guardian. Kaizen jumped down next to the detective, tossing a smoke bomb in his hands while his gaze dropped to the ground. He noted that the detective was the only one relieved to hear from him, the only one concerned about his safety, and the only one who asked if he was hungry or needed to talk about his day. Kaizen recalled how the detective scolded him after he got hurt and mischievously added that he was the first to ask how much it hurt on a scale of 1 to 10. He suggested that these reasons should convince the detective to take him in instead of Nezu. Nezu clapped his hands, instructing the heroes to calm down and take their seats. They complied, albeit with curious glances at Kaizen. Nezu expressed his pleasure at finally meeting Kaizen, to which Kaizen resisted the urge to scoff, replying that it was an honor to meet the rat god himself. Nezu remained unfazed, his grin widening as he got straight to business. He presented two options. Kaizen could become a ward of 𝐒𝐮𝐬 and Nezu's personal student, or Detective Tsukauchi could become his foster parent and legal guardian. Kaizen sighed, realizing he was committed to this decision, and chose the detective. Nezu's grin became slightly forced, but he sighed in defeat and agreed to process the paperwork quickly. Afterward, Nezu called off the meeting to start another one, this time with just himself, the detective, Eraserhead, Present Mic, Recovery Girl, and Kaizen. They made their way to Nezu's office, passing by Class 1C when Kaizen suddenly paused, sensing something. The professionals around him stopped and looked at him as he exhaled, creating a small cloud in the cold air. He felt the chill of his power spreading throughout his body and the school. As he glanced at Mike and Recovery Girl, he noticed they were shivering. It felt as if he were being pulled into a vision, but something felt off. Suddenly, his power flared to life, causing the room to frost over. He took another breath, trying to control the temperature, which helped somewhat. His quirk was eager to show him something, and he allowed himself to be drawn into the blank whiteness that accompanied it. The last thing he saw before being pulled into the vision was the worried face of the detective reaching out to him. Then everything went blindingly white. 𝐒𝐬 was trying to gather his emotions and thoughts as they swirled in his head. He felt overwhelmed by what Kaizen, his soon-to-be child, had said. Finally, he was meeting Kaizen in person, the very kid responsible for all those mini-heart attacks. Now that Kaizen stood next to him, 𝐒𝐬 could see him clearly. The boy appeared to be around 13 or 14 years old. 𝐒𝐬 noticed his emerald green eyes and how pale he looked. Kaizen wore a dark green hood to keep his hair hidden, black combat boots that seemed modified, and dark cargo briefs with pockets likely hiding more smoke bombs. He also wore a dark green jacket that looked like it was made of bulletproof material. What stood out most to 𝐒𝐬 was Kaizen's mask, which he had only seen from a distance. The black metal reflected the moonlight, serving as both a gas mask and a means for Kaizen to maintain his anonymity. The green blade-like slashes on the front of the mask caught 𝐒𝐬's attention. He had seen them glowing brightly before Kaizen vanished without a trace. Now that he was up close, he realized the glowing streaks were indeed blade slashes. His concern deepened when he recalled how Kaizen had mentioned being badly injured just hours ago. 𝐒𝐬 wondered how this kid was still standing. Kaizen glanced at him curiously but continued walking down the large halls of 𝐒𝐮𝐬. Suddenly he stopped, causing 𝐒𝐬 to turn to him in confusion. The room felt unusually cold, and 𝐒𝐬 glanced at Nezu, who was perched on Eraserhead's shoulder. Their eyes met, and Nezu's gaze was almost manic as he stared at something beside 𝐒𝐬. He quickly turned to Kaizen, who had completely halted, exhaling an icy breath that formed a cloud from his mask. Kaizen didn't appear confused or scared, indicating that this was likely the result of his quirk, presumably ice-related. But 𝐒𝐬 wondered why he activated it now. Kaizen closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The temperature in the room had improved slightly but remained colder than it should have been. When Kaizen opened his eyes, they swirled with shades of blue and green, wide with surprise and confusion. But the moment of wonder was short-lived. Suddenly, a wave of dangerously cold air surged through the space, spreading frost around the young teen and even reaching the trees outside the school. The protagonist reached out to the boy, feeling a sense of urgency. Kaizen's eyes turned completely blue, and he froze in place. Present Mike placed a hand on Kaizen's shoulder, only to retract it as if the boy had burned him. Mick's usual cheerful demeanor faded, replaced by a serious expression. He noted that the young listener was dangerously cold. The protagonist quickly bent down to meet Kaizen's gaze, gently slapping his cheek to rouse him. The boy seemed lost in thought, but when he finally looked up, his green eyes met the protagonist's black ones. Kaizen sighed, mumbling about feeling tired and having too much work to do. He looked up, already beginning to doze off, and apologized for worrying anyone. He explained that his quirk could overpower him at times, and this was one of those moments. The boy appeared completely drained of energy, swaying slightly. The protagonist stood beside him, feeling the weight of his lean form leaning into their side. Kaizen murmured about needing a nap, and the protagonist agreed that it seemed like a good idea. The boy then introduced himself as Izuku, requesting to be called by his name instead of the kid. Just like that, exhaustion overtook him. A soft smile crossed the protagonist's face as they repositioned Izuku into a comfortable carry. The name Izuku felt right, and the boy was light enough to carry without much effort. However, the protagonist noticed how cold he still was and realized he needed to get him a blanket quickly to prevent him from getting sick. Thoughts raced through their mind about how Izuku seemed a bit too light and whether he was eating enough. They also remembered the need to prepare a spare room and buy groceries, realizing they were not quite ready to bring a child home. As the protagonist pondered their responsibilities, they looked up to find 4 pairs of eyes watching them. Eraserhead wore a smug expression, while Mike looked on in disbelief as he handed Eraserhead a significant amount of money. Recovery Girl, who had been observing quietly, smiled and advised that Izuku should be taken to her or another licensed doctor for a checkup, as he would likely need a nutrition plan. The protagonist nodded in agreement, acknowledging that Izuku did need a medical evaluation. Nezu observed with a knowing look, commenting on how the protagonist was already acting like a parent. Recovery Girl suggested a quick checkup in the infirmary, noting that Izuku seemed to be suffering from extreme exhaustion but that they could never be too sure. Nezu added that it was important to return for the necessary information regarding Izuku's guardianship. The protagonist glanced down at the sleeping boy in their arms, realizing that while this journey would not be easy, it would be worth it. In a different setting, Hawks entered the main office of the Hero and Safety Commission, casually dressed in his hero suit and projecting a carefree vibe. However, beneath the surface, he felt like a puppet, trained to hide his emotions and serve as a weapon for others. Instinctively, he sensed that change was coming, and the downfall of the commission was near. Despite this, he resolved to remain silent and wait. Later, Izuku awoke on a comfortable couch, a large weighted blanket covering him. Confused, he realized he was not in a hospital or Recovery Girl's office. The question of where he was lingered in his mind. Although he usually relied on his quirk to see possible future outcomes, he felt too drained of energy to do so after such a powerful vision. There were many things he needed to accomplish before he could relax with his new guardian. With a sigh, he acknowledged his hunger and began to assess the situation. As he sat up, he noticed a black fluffy cat lounging on his lap, adding a touch of warmth to his surroundings. It just continued to lay on top of him without a care in the world. He looked at it with envy, wishing he could be as carefree. The cat seemed to embody a life of leisure, only concerned with when it would be fed next. Suddenly, he heard a grunt and instinctively relaxed his body, ready to move at a moment's notice. Eraserhead appeared, looking very tired and wrapped in a yellow sleeping bag, with an empty jelly pouch hanging from his mouth. Eraserhead confirmed that he had been left in his care by Tsukauchi, who had panicked and rushed off to prepare his apartment for the young hero's arrival. Izuku felt a wave of relief wash over him. He wondered how long he had been out and looked down at the purring cat before turning to Eraserhead. Eraserhead took a moment before revealing that Izuku had been unconscious for 3 days and had sustained serious injuries, including a stab wound and broken ribs. Izuku winced but added that he had actually suffered 4 broken ribs and a concussion. Eraserhead stared blankly at him, clearly struggling to comprehend the extent of his injuries. After a sigh, Eraserhead asked if Izuku was hungry. He shrugged and replied that he could eat. Eraserhead moved to the kitchen, searching through the fridge for something to offer. Izuku took the opportunity to look around the living space, noting that while the living room felt lived in, the kitchen was a bit chaotic. Eraserhead finally found a box of hero-themed cereal and handed it to Izuku, warning him not to tell Tsukauchi about the sugary snack. Izuku shrugged, not minding at all. As he prepared his breakfast, he caught Eraserhead's gaze and playfully remarked that he poured the cereal first, which earned him a hint of amusement from the usually stoic hero. Removing his mask, Izuku took a big spoonful of cereal and mentioned that All Might poured the milk first, nearly causing milk to shoot out of his nose from laughter. He smiled at Eraserhead, who was hiding behind a steaming mug of coffee. After a moment of comfortable silence, Izuku suggested that he would call Eraserhead Aizawa if Aizawa called him Izuku. This caught Aizawa off guard, but he nodded in agreement. As Izuku enjoyed his breakfast, his quirk suddenly warned him of an impending event. Activating it just enough to glimpse the future, he saw Present Mic burst in energetically, causing a commotion. Aizawa prepared to deactivate Izuku's quirk, but before he could, Izuku deactivated it himself and shared what he had seen. He proposed that they could use the situation to their advantage, suggesting that Present Mic might disrupt Aizawa's sleep if he didn't learn his lesson. Aizawa seemed to consider the idea, intrigued by the potential for mischief. 20 minutes later, they were walking to Aizawa's car, and Izuku was laughing so hard he could barely breathe, recalling how Present Mic had fallen. Aizawa wore a grin, acknowledging that Mike would surely knock next time. The car ride was mostly silent until Aizawa asked about Izuku's quirk. Izuku turned from the window to explain that his quirk was both unique and powerful, sharing that he had faced many challenges before learning to control it. Aizawa nodded, absorbing the information without pressing for more details. When they arrived at the small convenience store, the protagonist removed their mask and tucked it into a pocket of their suit, pulling down their hood. Now looking like a regular teenager, their face was fully visible. They felt Aizawa's gaze but chose to ignore it and followed him inside. Aizawa offered them a large amount of money, suggesting they needed yen. The protagonist giggled, refusing the offer, and reached into their pocket. Aizawa's eyes widened in surprise when he saw Hisashi's wallet. It was the first time the underground hero appeared genuinely astonished. After a moment of contemplation, Aizawa sighed and held up a finger, stating that this was a one-time exception. The protagonist nodded eagerly, mentally celebrating their small victory, thinking about how their jelly pouches would be covered by Mike this month. Upon entering the store, the worker shouted to a colleague, announcing the return of the energy drink kid, and joking about how much money they must spend each year. The protagonist felt their face flush with embarrassment, sensing Aizawa's curious gaze. They sighed and muttered to themselves, questioning if they were really that bad. Once the initial embarrassment faded, they headed to the energy drink section, scanning through the various flavors and brands. They quickly decided on their favorite and grabbed one of each flavor, not realizing they had spoken that last part aloud until they noticed a nearby employee freeze in confusion. After a brief moment, the employee shrugged it off and continued stocking the shelves. The protagonist hurried back to Aizawa, who was in the jelly pouch area. Approaching him from behind, they startled him, causing him to jump. The protagonist placed their energy drinks in the small basket he was holding, which made him grunt at the added weight. They shrugged off his annoyance, joking about being an experienced vigilante, but Aizawa shut down the conversation. After paying, courtesy of Present Mic, they made their way back to Aizawa's car. The protagonist reached into the bag Aizawa was holding and pulled out a random can labeled Blue Blast. They opened it without a care, eager to finally enjoy their energy drink after 3 long days without one. Just as they were about to take a sip, something collided with them, nearly causing them to topple over. They managed to regain their balance, but the drink spiraled away on the sidewalk. Frustrated, they sighed, feeling as if Aizawa had witnessed the 5 stages of grief play out on their face in under 30 seconds. Looking down, they expected to see a small dog or something similar that might have bumped into them, but instead, they were met with the red ruby eyes of a little girl. Recognizing her immediately, they grinned, knowing that Overhaul was likely not far behind. Activating their quirk, they felt the chill in the air as frost coated the ground beneath them. The little girl, Eri, clung to their leg as if her life depended on it. They made eye contact with Aizawa, who looked both confused and concerned. Relaxing their body, they focused on an alley not far away. They spoke to Eri, asking if a bad man was following her. She nodded, tears streaming down her face as she expressed her fear of being taken away. The protagonist felt a pang of empathy, wanting to comfort her. Introducing themselves as Kaizen and mentioning Aizawa as a hero, they watched as Eri's interest peaked. They explained that the man she feared hurt people and that they would ensure she would be safe. Eri, terrified, insisted that the man was too strong and would hurt them. The protagonist felt a surge of anger at the thought of someone traumatizing a child. They patted her head gently and leaned down to share a secret, telling her that they were stronger than the mean man. Her eyes widened in surprise, and she promised not to tell anyone. They instructed her to go with Izuku while they took care of something quickly. Eri hesitated but allowed herself to be picked up and placed into Izuku's hold. The protagonist then covered her ears and explained to Izuku that Eri was the granddaughter of the Hasaikai boss and that she had been left in the hands of her abuser, 𝐼𝐼. Izuku nodded, processing the information, and the protagonist smiled, knowing that Izuku understood the urgency of the situation. Izuku warned them that they needed to discuss a plan once they reached a safe location, but the protagonist could sense that this was just the beginning of a much larger challenge ahead. The atmosphere was tense as he regarded his opponent with a serious expression. He was confident that every possible outcome had been considered, and he stated that 𝐼𝐼 would soon be defeated. He instructed Eraserhead to take the girl to you, without hesitation, assuring him that he would handle the rest. He slipped into a nearby alley, using the damp walls to propel himself onto the rooftop. From his vantage point, he observed Eraserhead cursing in frustration, realizing he had seemingly vanished. The last thing he heard before Eraserhead dashed around a corner with the girl was a worried comment about Tsukauchi's potential wrath. With his mask and hood in place, he turned slowly, ready for a confrontation. His gaze locked onto the man who had harmed the girl. He noted that it had been wise for 𝐼𝐼 to flee upon recognizing the girl, but questioned his decision to linger. Each word dripped with disdain as he accused 𝐼𝐼 of being nothing more than a misguided wannabe hero. He chuckled, closing his eyes momentarily before continuing, pointing out 𝐼𝐼's refusal to acknowledge the truth of his actions. 𝐼𝐼's face twisted with rage, and he stepped back, visibly shaken. The confrontation escalated as 𝐼𝐼 removed his gloves, trembling with a mix of fear and anger. He declared that the protagonist would ruin his hard work, insisting that his actions had been for the good of his boss. They lunged at each other, the protagonist asserting that 𝐼𝐼 had no right to make such decisions, implying that the man who had taken him in would be disappointed. Meanwhile, Eraserhead hurriedly loaded bags into his car, securing the little girl in the back seat. He took a deep breath, feeling frustrated. When the girl asked about Kaizen, he reassured her that he was handling something important. She fell silent, though he could sense her fear. He couldn't shake his concern for the young vigilante, hoping he wasn't getting in over his head. As they approached the girl spoke again, inquiring how Kaizen knew her name. Surprised, he realized she had never met Kaizen before, leaving him puzzled about how the boy had acquired such knowledge. He concealed a smile as he responded, acknowledging that Kaizen had an uncanny ability to know things. In the midst of the conflict, Kaizen maintained steady breath as he evaded another barrage of 𝐼𝐼's spikes. With each successful dodge, he could see 𝐼𝐼's irritation grow. The battle shifted from rooftop to rooftop as he expertly maneuvered down a fire escape, leading 𝐼𝐼 into the dark alleyways below. As he landed on the concrete, he sensed 𝐼𝐼's presence above him, preparing to strike. He could see the villain's manic expression, a look of triumph that only fueled Kaizen's determination. With a grin hidden beneath his mask, he seized the opportunity he had anticipated. Using his left foot to propel himself high into the air, he executed a backflip, landing silently behind 𝐼𝐼. The chaos of the battle echoed around them, but he remained focused. He locked eyes with 𝐼𝐼, who was momentarily stunned. It was his turn now. Before 𝐼𝐼 could react, Kaizen utilized the alley walls to his advantage. In a desperate attempt to defend himself, 𝐼𝐼 hurled 2 large pieces of concrete at him. Kaizen couldn't resist taunting him, recalling 𝐼𝐼's earlier insult about being a wannabe hero. He laughed, declaring that heroics were not his forte. What followed would haunt 𝐼𝐼 for years to come. In a swift motion, Kaizen jumped onto one of the spikes, breaking it in half, and then did the same with the other. As his power surged, the alley walls began to frost. Seizing the moment, he kicked the broken spikes toward 𝐼𝐼 with all his might, landing silently behind the villain as the confrontation reached its climax. The eerie sound of something slicing through the air echoed in the empty alleyway. It was silent for a moment before the heavy thud of a body hitting the ground broke the stillness. Turning slowly, the sight that met my eyes was Overhaul's limp form crumpled on the ground. 2 spikes were embedded in him, one in his left leg and the other near his stomach. A trickle of blood ran down his leg from the sizable wound. He had fallen awkwardly, his right leg likely injured. Yet, my task was not complete. I watched as the villain shook off his shock and attempted to reassemble himself, but I was quicker. Grabbing his right arm, the only one he could move, I looked down at him with a smile as he trembled. The last thing he heard before I unleashed the icy side of my quirk was my declaration of victory. I froze both his arms, immobilizing him completely. A sigh of relief escaped me as the adrenaline began to fade. I stood there for a moment, ensuring he was merely unconscious and not dead, before surveying the alley. Guilt washed over me at the sight of the disarray, overturned trash cans and chunks missing from the alley walls. I slapped a hand to my forehead, scolding myself for not ending the confrontation sooner. Turning off my voice changer, I raised my arm to check my hack screen, curious about how long the fight had actually lasted. My face paled when I saw the time. It was already 6 in the afternoon, and the battle had lasted 4 hours. A single thought crossed my mind. Detective would be furious with Eraser for letting me go off on my own for so long. I chuckled nervously, then noticed a notification from 3 hours ago indicating that the detective's comm had been active for that duration. Swallowing hard, I hacked into the comm as I had done many times before. How Detective knew exactly when I connected was a mystery to me. He immediately began to express his concern, asking if I was okay, where I was, and if I had been hurt by the villain. I cut him off with a nervous chuckle, my face flushing with embarrassment as I reassured him that I was fine. I could hear his sigh of relief through the comm after a brief silence. He surprised me with his next question, asking if I had beaten the villain into the ground. My eyes widened in shock before I burst into laughter, gasping for breath as I confirmed that I had indeed done so, adding that he hadn't been pleased with my performance. I quickly sent a picture of the defeated Yakuza. Detective then asked if I had thrown a blue paint bomb at him. I shuffled my feet, feeling guilty. I admitted that it wasn't paint but rather extreme frostbite. Earlier, Naomasa had felt a wave of panic as he got into the car after leaving Eraser's apartment. He didn't want to leave the kid behind. He had stayed by his side since he fainted 3 days ago, sitting in that uncomfortable plastic chair in U.S. infirmary until Recovery Girl cleared him. She wouldn't allow him to take the boy home until his apartment was ready. Although upset, he understood her reasoning. He didn't even have instant noodles, let alone groceries for a growing boy. After some convincing from Eraser, Recovery Girl, Midnight, and Mike, he reluctantly agreed to go shopping. Now, he found himself in the mall with his seldom-used savings card and an enthusiastic Sansa by his side. Sansa was busy jotting down everything they needed, treating it like an investigation. Naomasa felt overwhelmed by the amount of shopping ahead. He sighed, already feeling tired before they even began. They headed to the nearest furniture store to buy a bedroom set for his new charge, with Sansa trailing behind. Sansa asked how long he thought the kid would remain asleep, causing Naomasa to freeze mid-step as panic threatened to take over. He swallowed his worry and continued walking, insisting they needed to hurry and hoping the boy wouldn't get into any trouble if he woke up. Sansa, sensing his anxiety, reassured him that even if the kid did wake up and get into mischief, Eraser would stop him. Naomasa nodded, feeling slightly better. They had a lot of shopping and setting up to do. In the alley, the only sounds were the cars speeding by and a stray cat rummaging for food. A glance at my device confirmed I was still connected to the comm. I wondered if the frostbite had been excessive. A noise pulled me from my thoughts. Was that a huff of amusement? I raised my hand to my forehead, checking for a fever, as I couldn't believe the detective, an adult, wouldn't scold me for injuring someone, even if he was a villain. That was what adults were supposed to do when kids misbehaved, right? My mother had never scolded me, but she wasn't a reliable comparison. I asked in bewilderment if he wasn't going to reprimand me, glancing down at Overhaul's limp body, his face scratched and swollen from the fall. His side and leg still had a spike protruding from his flesh, his eyes rolled back so far they appeared white. Blood dripped onto the floor beneath him. Internally, he felt a sense of satisfaction. The villain had received his due. He thought to himself that he understood why the detective wasn't angry about the punishment he had dealt to this unfortunate individual. The detective then spoke, amusement evident in his tone as he mentioned the report from Sir Night-Eye. He muttered something almost incoherent, a reminder of their shared experiences. The detective continued, acknowledging that Overhaul was indeed the right target for such treatment. If what the villain claimed was true, it meant that the young hero had rendered a dangerous adversary incapable of using his quirk ever again. Worry crept in as he considered the possibility that the detective might be lying, and he remained silent, his thoughts drifting back to the challenging days of middle school. He recalled how not only his classmates but also the teachers had made those years difficult. He reminded himself that the detective was different. He had always been kind. The detective's voice pulled him from his gloomy reverie, suggesting that he would let this incident slide this time. He then asked for the information on the case, proposing they head to you to finalize everything if that was still his intention. Without hesitation, he replied that it sounded good. He acknowledged his exhaustion, having slept for 3 days, and admitted he really just wanted to rest. He turned away from the fallen villain, letting out a sleepy yawn and rubbing his eyes as he walked deeper into the greasy, humid alleyway. Pulling out his handy hacking device, he began typing on the screen, quickly reviewing all the information. He could hear the detective typing on his computer, likely preparing everything on his end for a swift and efficient investigation. After triple-checking the data, he sent it over to the detective's computer. The detective acknowledged receipt of the data, and moments later, he could hear the sounds of the detective communicating with his colleagues, flipping through case files, and typing rapidly. The detective then asked if he was still at the scene or if he had left, mentioning he would pick him up for a meal before heading to you. He considered his options and decided to return to the apartment first, wanting to change out of his vigilante costume before they left. He stood on the rooftop, looking down at the alleyway, waiting for the detective's approval before heading toward 𝐒𝐮𝐬's old apartment. The detective expressed concern about him going alone, offering to arrive in 5 minutes so they could gather anything he wanted to take with him. The sound of keys jingling indicated the detective was leaving his office, followed by the click of the door. He shrugged, even though the detective couldn't see him, and agreed that it would work. As he waited on the roof, surrounded by the noise of the bustling city and his own thoughts, he suddenly felt a spike in his quirk. Falling to his knees, he was overwhelmed by a jolt of energy that drained what little strength he had left. The power coursed through him, and his breath became visible in the cold air. His mind shifted into analytical mode, recalling a strong vision he had experienced just days ago while walking through you, one that had revealed 𝐼𝐬𝐬's life and struggles. He wondered why his quirk was acting up again and if it signaled something significant he would soon face. Frustration bubbled within him, but he was pulled into another vision. He mentally chastised himself for everything that had transpired in the last few days, wishing for nothing more than an energy drink. He rubbed the bridge of his nose in annoyance, knowing he could reject the vision but feeling it was important. He sensed that this was likely another situation involving a dangerous individual that needed investigation. Meanwhile, Hawks soared through the night sky, feeling a sense of freedom as he flew over the city. The lights below resembled stars scattered across the galaxy. The refreshing night air was a welcome escape from his worries, and he took a deep breath, enjoying the moment. Just then his phone rang, breaking his reverie. He took another breath before answering, knowing only one person would call him at this hour. The voice on the other end urged him to hurry, demanding he arrive within 10 minutes for a mission. The sound of paperwork being tossed around was audible before the call ended abruptly. He glared at the black screen of his phone, feeling the weight of responsibility settle in. With a resigned sigh, he dove down, closing his eyes and embracing the rush of air through his feathers and hair. I quickly made my way to Yakumura-Mera's office, known as the president of the Hero Safety Commission. I arrived within 5 minutes, just as she requested. When I landed softly on the large office floor, she didn't acknowledge my presence. I stood there, waiting for her to address me. Fortunately, it didn't take long. She finally looked up from a file and said my name, though her gaze remained on the document. I bowed slightly in greeting. She continued, her arms crossed and a familiar grumpy expression on her face. She spoke quickly and steadily, informing me that there was another mission for me. She slid a file in my direction, finally making eye contact. The mission was straightforward. Eliminate the threat, permanently. As I glanced down at the file, disbelief washed over me. It was a thin, light vanilla folder, similar to many others piled on her desk. However, it wasn't the appearance of the folder that raised alarm bells in my head, it was what she had said. This was all the information they had on the target. The Hero Safety Commission clearly needed this threat dealt with urgently, yet this was all they could provide. If they were sending me, it meant they were at their wits' end. I opened the file, curiosity piqued, but what I read next shocked me. Classified last updated XX/XX/XX rank S mission, eliminate target Kaizen first name, unknown last name, unknown birth date, unknown quirk, unknown possibly a stealth or intelligence quirk nationality, unknown kill count, 5 to 6 unfortunately unproven occupation, vigilante crimes, vigilantism, hacking of government classified software, damage to property, evading capture, assault others to be added later. As I scanned the page, I almost laughed. They had actually added damage to property to his record after he egged and splashed paint on their office. I sighed, recalling my previous encounter with Kaizen. I regrettably admitted to myself that I had no chance of capturing him. He was like a mini Nezu, and yes, I meant mini because I realized he was just a kid. Not that she knew that. They never asked me directly, so I kept that significant piece of information to myself. I looked up at the president and nodded stiffly before quickly flying away, my mind racing. Kaizen appeared to be around 12 or 13 years old and already had 5 kills on his record. That was astonishing. Although my hands weren't clean either, I was already 24, it was different. He probably didn't even do it. I hadn't allowed myself to think about it much since I found out a month ago. But well, he was a kid. Why was a child engaging in vigilante activities? Better yet, how was he doing it? I sighed, feeling a headache coming on. Was this how Detective Tsukauchi felt every day? If so, I needed to send him a gift basket filled with coffee. Defeated before I even began, I thought to myself that I might not understand his reasoning now, but I wasn't going to waste my time and sanity trying to hunt him down. The commission was on their own. As Kaizen, I opened my eyes to a world engulfed in red. It felt as if I had walked into a smoke bomb. Blinking in surprise and confusion, I soon realized it was Hawks I was glitching. As I backed away from the pro, his image formed piece by piece. Only when he fully materialized could I grasp the vision's context. Hawks appeared younger, maybe 19 or 20 years old. Across the room stood an angry woman wielding a large ruler-like object, approaching him. Dread settled in my stomach. This vision was revealing Hawk's past. I narrowed my eyes at the woman, suspecting why I was shown this, though I hoped I was wrong. A loud noise startled me. The grumpy woman slammed her metal ruler on the ground, yelling at Hawks to continue his training, which felt more like torture. I winced in sympathy for the pro-hero before making a beeline for the door. My focus shifted to my new goal, taking down the commission, starting with information gathering. As Izuku, I sat on a rooftop, anxiously waiting for the detective to arrive. Would he actually come, or would he decide I wasn't worth it? Would he be angry with me for running off? Would he leave like that disappointing excuse for a parent, Inko? When she revealed her true colors, I felt a deep disappointment. I buried my emotions, trying to cope by immersing myself in missions. When that didn't work, I resorted to pranks, convincing myself I didn't need a loving home. Even on nights when I returned from missions, bleeding from cuts or bruises, I tried to convince myself that I didn't need a caring mother or father waiting for me. But I wasn't naive. I knew all too well that each time I came back to that dark, empty apartment, something inside me broke. 3 years ago, at the age of 10, my thoughts raced as I climbed the stairs of the apartment complex. Closing his eyes for a moment, Izuku focused on keeping his quirk under control. He couldn't afford to lose it now, especially after finally receiving a vision of his own world. He made excuses to justify his mother's actions, convincing himself that she was simply busy or tired from working hard. He told himself she didn't mean to ignore him and that he was capable of taking care of himself. After all, he was no longer a child. But as he reflected on it, he realized he was only making excuses for the neglect he had endured. A 10-year-old trying to survive on the $20 𝐒𝐮𝐬 left on the counter on random days. It hurt to acknowledge the reality of the situation, a realization that had come only through his vision. He could almost hear her laughter echoing in his mind. He remembered the excitement he felt when he had finally discovered where his mother had been for the past 2.5 weeks. The joy of finding answers quickly faded as he recalled the moment he had seen her through the window, laughing with a little girl who couldn't have been older than 3. His half-sister. In that moment he felt frozen, unable to think, move, or even breathe. The sight of his mother and the little girl faded into the background as his emotions surged. He struggled to regain control of his quirk, forcing his feelings deep down until he finally managed to deactivate it. But he knew the damage had already been done. Lying in his hero-themed bed, he looked around his room, feeling an overwhelming coldness. It was as if the room itself had frozen in time. He lay there, temporarily blinded by tears, as everything ached. The realization that his mother had never loved him hit him hard, and he found himself sobbing, his emotions choking him. Hot tears streamed down his cheeks as he clutched his blanket, trying to shield himself from the hurt that came with his inability to control his quirk. As the pain began to subside, he closed his eyes, letting unconsciousness take him. He couldn't help but wonder if anyone would ever look at him the way 𝐒𝐮𝐬 had looked at that little girl. The question of whether she loved him was no longer relevant. He knew the truth. 𝐒𝐮𝐬 did not love him. No one did. After the vision, Izuku had much to contemplate and plan. He wiped his eyes, determined not to let the past make him cry again. That was years ago, and it shouldn't affect him anymore. Just as he was lost in thought, he noticed officers swarming below, hurrying to secure an unconscious villain. He had made sure the villain wouldn't pose a threat, perhaps hitting him a little harder than necessary to ensure he stayed down. Despite the weight of his responsibilities and the challenges he faced, a smile crept onto his face at the sight of Naomasa Tsukauchi calling out to him. For a moment, the burdens of his quirk and reputation faded away, reminding him why he had chosen to trust the detective. Tsukauchi called out, asking where he was and mentioning he was starving. Izuku smiled, feeling a sense of warmth. He took a deep breath before jumping down to join him, playfully grabbing onto the detective's overcoat. Tsukauchi, caught off guard, managed to secure him safely, carrying him like a backpack. The detective shook his head with amusement, a small smile on his face as they walked to his car. As Izuku began to doze off, Tsukauchi mentioned that Eraserhead had brought up an incident involving Present Mix Wallet. He mimicked Eraserhead's tired and moody tone, recounting the story of how Mike had stumbled due to a prank involving expired jelly packets and soap on the floor. Izuku chuckled softly, feeling a sense of belonging and comfort in the detective's presence. The moment he walked through, blocking his vision with the jelly and slipping on the soap, he hit his head hard on the floor. The detective sighed tiredly, relieved that the young boy had spent all his extra energy defeating that Yakuza boss. Who knew what mischief he could have gotten into otherwise? The boy huffed, admitting that he only got into trouble when he wanted to or when he was bored, lonely, or tired. The detective tilted his head, momentarily pausing his steps to look at him. After a moment of thought, he grinned and declared that if he was the grumpy detective, then the boy was his snarky kid. Izuku felt ashamed to admit that holding back his tears was far more difficult than his fight with Overhaul. He buried his face between the detective's shoulder and neck, gripping his tan overcoat a little too tightly. He mumbled a quiet acknowledgement, and if a few tears dripped onto the detective's neck, he said nothing about it, for which Izuku was grateful. The detective carried him as if he had done it 1,000,000 times before, treating him like a kid, his kid. He mentioned needing to park a little farther away than he would have liked, but he passed the time by asking Izuku questions about his old apartment his favorite foods, and his favorite animal. As the questions continued, Izuku began to sag in his hold, his eyelids growing heavy. Trying to stay awake, he glanced to his left as the detective walked along the buzzing streets. People were busy with their own activities. Food carts with vendors calling out their offerings, civilians chatting about various topics, and children dragging their parents toward a bustling toy store. The worker at a nearby grocery store greeted customers at the door, and the light beeping of the cashier scanning items filled the air. As they passed the store, Izuku's mind wandered back to his own experiences there. He fought the urge to laugh humorlessly, realizing another depressing fact. Even at the young age of 7, he had always been alone during grocery trips. Inko would give him $20 every week and a half, but she never explicitly told him it was for him. The first time she expected him to shop and budget on his own, he had nearly starved. Until then, she had always bought food for him, allowing him to eat whatever he wanted. It seemed she had grown tired of that responsibility. Internally, he snarled, thinking about how she had let her 7-year-old go to the store alone. It was a wonder he hadn't been hurt or kidnapped. He closed his eyes, trying to clear his thoughts. The beeping of the store faded, replaced by the sounds of rushing water from a laundromat as they passed by its open doors. The scent of various detergents overwhelmed his senses, causing him to scrunch up his face in discomfort. The detective chuckled at his reaction, prompting Izuku to huff at him before returning his gaze to the laundromat receding in the distance. He had nothing against the business, but every visit had a story. Either he had stayed out too late and Inko had locked him out, probably forgetting he was even there, or she had forgotten to leave him any money. In those moments, he would run to a laundromat in a wealthier neighborhood and resort to pickpocketing unsuspecting rich patrons. It had been a while since he had gone on a real pickpocketing adventure, not counting what Eraserhead now referred to as the present mic incident. Suddenly, his thoughts halted, and a wicked grin spread across his face as he recalled something he had done before his fight. The idea was too enticing to resist, and a tired sigh escaped his lips as the thought of a nice nap became increasingly appealing. By the time they reached the car, Izuku was fast asleep, his head resting on the detective's shoulder, his eyes still a little red and puffy from earlier. A sad smile formed on the detective's face as they approached his black SUV. He opened the back door carefully, ensuring not to jostle the boy, and placed him gently on the seat, strapping him in securely. His eyes fell on the stacks of paperwork piled up next to Izuku, and he quickly moved them out of paranoia that they might fall on him. Once the paperwork was safely out of the way, he eyed the boy's mask with unease, wondering if it was safe for him to keep it on while he slept. Recovery Girl hadn't commented much on it. Should he wake him up? Before he could weigh the pros and cons, Izuku blinked up at him, still half asleep, and the detective felt a twinge of guilt for waking him with all the movement. But the character quickly asked if he could remove the mask. He nodded, mumbling sleepily about needing to add ultrasonic scanners and upgrades for later, before drifting back to sleep. The character shrugged it off and spent the next few minutes figuring out how to take it off. Eventually, they found 2 buttons on each side of the mask. Pushing them both down at the same time, the mask was easily removed. Once the mask was off, it revealed Izuku completely. His hair was jet black, just like the character's, but the ends were a dark green, fading out. It seemed they would soon share the same color. It was as if all the clues from the past year suddenly clicked together, revealing a neglected, overworked, brilliant child. The character inhaled sharply while gazing down at the young boy, realizing how young he truly was to be facing such challenges. Although they didn't have all the information about his family life yet, it was clear that this boy was too small and too bright for the harshness of the world. His face was relieved and sleepy, his breath even and soft, but most of all, he looked exhausted. It was hard to believe this was the same Kaizen who had just defeated Overhaul moments ago. The character concluded that this was not a side of him people often saw. He was typically hyperactive and childish, yet capable of being deadly and fierce when necessary. Some might even find him intimidating. But in this moment, he appeared as a child who had been failed by everyone around him, his parents, the heroes, the commission, the education system, and even the villains. Most importantly, he had been failed by those who were supposed to love and protect him. It was easy to understand why he chose to be a vigilante. A vigilante is neither a hero nor a villain. They operate outside the commission, often as adversaries. They are known for playing by their own rules. A sad smile formed on the character's lips at this thought. They affectionately patted Izuku's head before closing the car door. Once in the driver's seat, the character took a deep breath, knowing they would eventually have to meet with Nezu again. Frustration with the principal had spiked during their last meeting when he suggested Izuku would be better off as a ward of you. Glancing at Izuku in the rearview mirror, the character noticed he hadn't moved much but had turned his head, pressing the side of his face against the seat. They chuckled and snapped a quick picture before placing an order for pickup at one of their favorite restaurants, a place they usually frequented during lunch breaks or on particularly tough days. The character recalled that Izuku mentioned he really liked 𝐒𝐮𝐬 and quickly placed the order before starting the car to pick it up. Grabbing their phone, they sent a quick message to Eraserhead, grinning mischievously as they chuckled quietly while glancing at their sleeping child. It seemed Eraser was right. The character truly knew their kid better than anyone. Aizawa Shoto was feeling more tired than usual. After arriving at U.A. with Eri, she was placed under heavy security and supervision. A checkup revealed everything was fine except for her nutrition and weight levels. She was slightly malnourished. He had left her in the care of Recovery Girl, who seemed to make the young girl feel comfortable. Eri still appeared frightened of him. Slipping out of her room while she marveled at candy apples with Recovery Girl, he found the atmosphere in the station exhausting. The police force members were bustling around like crazed bulls. He lazily asked about the situation while pouring himself a cup of coffee, his shoulders slumped. Suddenly, Kaneyashiki froze and paled at what she saw on her screen, calling over the chief frantically. A crowd of detectives and police gathered around the desk as Aizawa found a quiet corner, coffee in hand, to observe. The chief called everyone for a meeting, and Aizawa nodded and took a seat in the meeting room. It was silent for a few moments before Kaneyashiki cleared her throat nervously. She explained that they had an insider on Kaizen's platform and access to another platform the young vigilante used. Just minutes ago, they received confirmation that Overhaul had been defeated and could no longer use his quirk. Kaizen had somehow managed to inflict severe frostbite on both his hands, causing lifelong pain and disability. A suspicious number of officers coughed or sipped their coffee, trying to hide smiles and laughter at the boy's antics. Aizawa couldn't help but hide his own smile behind his capture weapon. He even thought he heard Sansa cough and mutter, "Deserved," mid-cough. Kaneyashiki continued, revealing that about 20 minutes before his confrontation with Overhaul, Kaizen had posted a warning on a popular villain and vigilante platform, stating that the 8 bullets were his targets and that anyone who dared to interfere would face consequences. Aizawa paled, recalling Izuku doing something on the small screen attached to his arm while they were heading to the convenience store. He realized that Izuku had anticipated all of this, just as he had known Mike would walk through Aizawa's apartment door. Most quickly agreed to assist Kaizen, while some villains even offered free services. Many vigilantes expressed concern for Kaizen's well-being. After much persuasion, the boy eventually decided to put a bounty on capturing all the members of the 8 bullets. The conference room fell silent, and Sansa rubbed his temple, incredulous. It was hard to believe that Naomesa's new kid had placed a bounty on the heads of 8 dangerous Yakuza members as if it were nothing. The feline officer slumped back into his seat, mumbling about not looking forward to that kid's teenage years. Just as Izuku was about to call Nezu, his phone vibrated with a new message. It was from Tsukauchi, and as he read it, he couldn't help but facepalm, drawing a few odd looks from the police present, which he ignored in favor of replying. Tsukauchi's message indicated that his kid had put a bounty on someone's head. Izuku confirmed it, feeling a mix of exasperation and amusement. Despite being sleepy, this chapter revealed how Izuku had managed to survive without a proper parental figure. He had become quite the little thief, and it made sense that he would be upset over Eri's mistreatment. He could relate to the struggle of not being able to control a dangerously powerful quirk. Like Eri, he had suffered from the absence of someone to reassure him that everything would be all right. In a way, he had become that person for Eri, the one who had never been there for him. Izuku woke up to someone lightly shaking his shoulder, a common occurrence that usually meant trouble. It could mean he was passed out in an alleyway again or waking up after surgery, which would lead to another scolding. His reaction was instinctive. He grabbed a flashbang and a small, sharp blade, ready to flee if necessary. When he finally focused, he saw the detective in front of him, concern etched on his face. Izuku's eyes darted around, still fighting off the remnants of sleep. Realizing he was safe, he put away the weapons he had drawn. The detective's expression shifted to one of sadness and anger, but not directed at Izuku. Instead, he was upset with someone else. The detective expressed that he wasn't angry at Izuku for his reaction but at the circumstances that led to it. Izuku nodded, though he didn't fully grasp the meaning behind the words. To avoid spiraling into overthinking, he turned to look out the window, only to freeze when he saw Inko's old apartment. His breath hitched. He never thought he would return to this place, especially not with a new parental figure. The detective fell silent, concern now evident on his face. He reassured Izuku that they were only there to gather what he needed before heading home. If Izuku had changed his mind about coming back, that was fine too. Izuku swallowed down his emotions, sadness, anger, regret, fear, but the hardest to contain was hope, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Pushing those emotions aside, he focused on what needed to be done. Sighing, he met the detective's gaze. He assured him he was okay and suggested they go inside, mentioning that the detective had brought food. The detective nodded, grabbing the food bag and 3 empty duffel bags. Izuku quickly offered to help him carry some of the bags he struggled to hold. They made their way to the apartment, footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. When they reached the door, Izuku unlocked it and stepped inside. He slipped on his house slippers while the detective took the guest pair. Just as Izuku was about to turn on the lights, he remembered that Inko had stopped paying the electric bill. Annoyed, he made his way to the large window in the dining room, relieved to find enough light for them to see and eat. The detective looked at him, confusion on his face. Izuku explained that Inko had stopped paying for electricity about 2.5 weeks ago. The detective didn't seem surprised, but Izuku noticed a flash of anger cross his face. Then the detective made a surprising statement, acknowledging Inko as Izuku's mother and confirming that the station had been on the right track. He explained that they had initially been thrown off by Izuku's school records, which indicated he was quirkless, but they had since realized he was not. Izuku was taken aback. He understood the confusion regarding his quirk status, but he had given the detective his name. Had he not looked into his file, or was his code too difficult to break? As the thoughts settled in, the character realized they had added extra security to their government file. They wondered if the detective had already read it, assuming Nezu would have looked into it first. The detective nodded, opening a to-go bag and taking out their meals. With a small smile, he continued rummaging through the bag without looking up. He acknowledged that Nezu had likely reviewed the file but stated he hadn't asked for it, confident that his co-workers would find it soon. This would allow them to take legal action to ensure the character remained under his care, avoiding any chance of being placed into the system, even temporarily. The character blinked in surprise, processing his words. After a moment, they slapped their forehead, reminding themselves to keep their quirk active throughout the day as usual. They shared that all they knew was that their mother had left them alone in the apartment, though the time frame was unclear. A small part of them felt grateful for the opportunity to inform the detective directly. A smile crept onto their face as they decided to reveal their secrets. They had enjoyed watching him scramble to solve the mysteries for months. The detective's expression deflated, reminiscent of a balloon animal losing air, as he recalled the times they had driven him to worry. Feeling a twinge of guilt, the character made a decision to remove the extra security on their file. They cautiously trailed off before flashing their famous grin, suggesting it was time for the detective to learn about the chaos in both sides of their life. It was ironic that no one ever noticed that Kaizen and Izuku were the same person, combined to form what could be called one snarky kid. From the detective's perspective, he grinned back, finally understanding Nezu's eagerness to have this child as a personal student. The kid's eyes sparkled with mischief, but a hint of nervousness slipped into his tone as he reiterated the chaos of his life. The detective found amusement in the nickname, knowing it would stick. Izuku agreed wholeheartedly before rushing off to wash his hands, while the detective began to explore the apartment. Flipping the light SWH confirmed the kid's claim about his BRH mother neglecting the electric bill. Then his attention was caught by a bright yellow paper peeking from the zippers of a dark green school bag. He quickly snatched it, reading the bold letters, "Second eviction notice." Anger bubbled within him as he glared at the floor, a clearer picture of the kid's life forming in his mind, and it was not a pleasant one. Moments later, Izuku returned to the kitchen, and they both sat down to eat. The kid mentioned he would make his file accessible later, but a question slipped from the detective's lips about where the idea of becoming a vigilante had come from. To his surprise, Izuku answered without hesitation, mentioning it might relate to one of his first visions. Curious, the detective inquired if this meant he had a future scene quirk. Izuku shook his head, a small smile on his face, and glanced down at his food. After a sigh, he stood to clear the table, leaving the detective surprised to find his own container empty, realizing he had eaten it all without noticing. They moved to the living area, where Izuku grabbed the empty duffel bags meant for him and gestured for the detective to follow him down the hallway. Once inside his room, they began packing books and clothes for the detective, while Izuku carefully took down a few rare posters. Packing was quick, but suddenly Izuku's expression shifted as if he remembered something important. He called the detective over to see something in the closet. The detective raised an eyebrow, intrigued. As Izuku pushed aside the remaining clothes, the detective's eyes widened in disbelief at what he saw. A hero-grade ultrasonic padlock mounted on the back wall of the closet. Izuku explained that it had been challenging to acquire but worth it. Scanning his thumbprint, the padlock activated, and a robotic voice announced new messages. The closet walls folded open, revealing a hidden area filled with various chemicals and a wall displaying his gadgets, including smoke bombs and flashbangs. Izuku stepped into the secret space, a puzzled look on his face, wondering about the messages and what they could mean regarding the Todoroki case or the news of his kidnapping reaching the underground. And so he began mumbling, coming up with ideas about why he had an unusual number of requests. Then the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He was raising a mini Nezu. Izuku walked into his little hideout, skillfully dodging the many smoke bombs that littered the floor. They had fallen off their stands while he was resting in Eraser's apartment. His body moved on autopilot, avoiding the small circular bombs, but his mind was consumed by curiosity. What had he done to receive so many requests in such a short time? There were too many possibilities to consider. Making his way over to the computer, he quickly logged in, not even registering the detective sitting on his bed, his hands clutching his head as he looked down at the floor. He was mumbling something about Nezu, parenting books, a team-up, and world domination. Izuku shrugged it off, not wanting to pry. It wasn't his business. Once he was logged into his computer, codes began to fill the screen, and his eyes darted across it at an alarming speed, checking the security he had in place on his platform. After ensuring that both his platform and government backdoors were secure, he finally clicked over to his notifications page. As he scanned the messages, he quickly understood the situation he had gotten himself into. A feral grin spread across his face as he went through the messages. That was when the detective decided to speak up, asking what had happened. Izuku turned around, still grinning, and explained that precisely 7:03 p.m., about 24 minutes ago, an insider had leaked what he did to overhaul on the internet. Reporters had seized the story like a pack of wild animals, and soon journalists were going crazy over the discovery of a mysterious vigilante. The detective hummed in response. Izuku looked back at the screen, intending to continue his work, but he noticed something else on his desk that caught his attention. His eyes widened in disbelief, and then excitement filled them as he realized what it was. There, standing on his desk, was an open can of his favorite brand of energy drink. He quickly snatched it up, as if something might crawl from the shadows to take it away from him. Bringing it to his lips, he intended to drink it all in a time frame that seemed impossible, only to realize it was completely empty. A small frown formed on his face as he let his head slump down onto the keyboard, hitting it harder than he expected. The detective jumped at the loud sound that followed. He asked if Izuku was feeling okay, to which Izuku nodded without looking up. The detective expressed concern, noting that it didn't seem like he was fine. Once Izuku explained that he hadn't had his favorite drink for almost 4 days, the detective nodded, promising to take him to the store to buy some on their way home. The words still felt odd to hear, and Izuku realized it would take some getting used to. He blinked, shaking his head as if to clear his thoughts. He was getting distracted. News stations were broadcasting about the defeat of the very dangerous villain boss, and this might change a few things. His gaze fell back to the screen as he rambled his thoughts aloud. It was then that he remembered he had yet to reactivate his quirk. Not having a small portion activated throughout the day had its effects on him. Quickly, he activated it, feeling the familiar sensation of his power flow back into his body, like breathing fresh air for the first time in forever. The detective's reaction was immediate. He jumped up from where he was sitting and rushed over to Izuku's side at the computer. He asked if Izuku was okay, recalling that the last time his eyes looked like that, he had been out for 3 days. Izuku quickly reassured him that he was not in any danger, even as the detective suggested they see Recovery Girl again, already pulling out his phone. Izuku insisted he was fine and didn't need to go to the hospital or see a doctor. The detective still looked uneasy, and a quick glance at the phone screen revealed Recovery Girl's contact. Izuku decided to explain a few things, a sigh escaping his lips as guilt began to claw at his mind. He apologized, which made the detective snap his attention from his phone to him so fast that Izuku thought he might get whiplash. The detective asked what he was apologizing for, insisting he hadn't done anything wrong. Izuku shook his head slowly in disagreement, explaining that it must have been scary to watch him freeze up like that, especially since it was so sudden. The whole below zero body temperature thing could be alarming. The detective's eyes widened at that, and he looked as if he was about to burst with concern. Izuku immediately knew he had messed up. Waving his hands to calm him down, he spoke before the detective could utter a word. He reassured him that it was normal for him when he got a vision. His quirk made his body really cold when fully activated, so cold that it formed ice. His thoughts drifted back to the frosted over 𝐒𝐬, a high school as he looked at the detective again. He was sure the detective understood. Realizing that this was normal for him visibly decreased the detective's worry. Izuku sighed in relief, but his brain decided it wasn't done yet. He blurted out that his quirk was called Total Omniscient. The words tumbled out before he could comprehend what he had just revealed. All his doubts and insecurities flooded in, taking over his thoughts. He felt like an idiot for dropping that bombshell on the grumpy detective. He worried that he wouldn't want him now. One of his hands came up to grasp his head in frustration. The detective stood still for a couple of minutes, processing what had just been said. This pause allowed Izuku to shake off his earlier self-doubt. He realized that being direct was the best approach. There was no reason to waste time. He explained that omniscient was an English word meaning infinite knowledge and recalled the detective's mention of having visions. Nodding along, he continued, acknowledging the significance of the name. He then asked if he could pose a question. Just then, his quirk flared up, signaling that a vision was coming. It wasn't as intense as the ones he experienced at 𝐒𝐬, so he felt he could manage it. He adjusted the temperature around them, making it comfortable. A smile crept onto his face as he reflected on how far he had come. Now that he had a chance at a family, he was determined not to waste it. All the years of hard work had led him to this moment, where he finally felt in control of his destiny. No longer would he live in fear of his quirk or himself. The only lingering question was whether he truly trusted the detective. A smile formed on his face as he realized he already knew the answer. With a playful expression, he looked up at the detective and raised an eyebrow, asking if he believed in other universes. He went on to explain that he had visions not only of their world but of countless others, revealing that he possessed, in a way, infinite knowledge. From Naomesa's perspective, his life had revolved around his work since graduating from the police academy and becoming a top-tier detective. If someone had suggested adopting a child a few years prior, he would have thought they were crazy. He would have dismissed the idea, claiming he was too busy for a family. But now, standing before Izuku, he felt a mix of shock and disbelief at the revelation. He struggled to find the right words, feeling as though he were floundering. Izuku's quirk was not a typical future-seeing ability, it was something entirely new, a multi-universal vision quirk. The thought of All for One discovering this child's power sent a chill down his spine. He glanced down at Izuku, who was staring at his hands, his eyes glistening. It struck 𝐒𝐬𝐬 all at once how long he had been frozen in place. When Izuku noticed him looking, he began fidgeting with one of his smoke bombs. 𝐒𝐬𝐬 crouched to meet his gaze and gently urged him to look up. When Izuku finally turned, 𝐒𝐬𝐬 felt a wave of guilt for his earlier inaction. The boy looked like a lost puppy, and his apology cut deep. He expressed his understanding if 𝐒𝐬𝐬 no longer wanted him, admitting that he felt like a burden. The pain in Izuku's voice and expression was palpable, a mix of hope and resignation. 𝐒𝐬𝐬 took a deep breath, wanting to reassure him. He affirmed that he wanted to adopt Izuku and was proud of him for being brave enough to share his quirk. Nothing would change that fact. Izuku stood frozen for a moment, processing 𝐒𝐬𝐬's words. When he asked if nothing he said would change 𝐒𝐬𝐬's mind, the detective confirmed that it wouldn't. A sad laugh escaped Izuku, and his shoulders slumped. He shared a painful memory from when he was 4, when he was told he was quirkless, a moment that had not deterred his dream of becoming a detective. He recalled a time when he had bumped into 𝐒𝐬𝐬 as a child, lost and helped back home. 𝐒𝐬𝐬 remembered that night vividly, as it had led to an investigation into Izuku's mother, though nothing had come of it. He acknowledged how much Izuku had changed since then, noting the shift in his hair color. Izuku continued his story, explaining how his quirk had manifested a year later, bringing with it overwhelming energy that he struggled to control. He described the visions he experienced, some of which showed him as a hero, others as a feared villain, and more. He recounted how he had become a vigilante, revealing the trauma he had endured, including neglect and abandonment by his mother. As he shared his experiences, both he and 𝐒𝐬𝐬 felt a surge of emotions. Izuku from the nerves of reliving his past, and 𝐒𝐬𝐬 from anger at the injustices the boy had faced. After Izuku finished, 𝐒𝐬𝐬 asked if he could hug him. When Izuku nodded, he embraced the boy, resting his chin on his head. Izuku's voice was muffled as he expressed his feelings about never wanting to see his mother again. 𝐒𝐬𝐬 agreed, promising to call the chief to secure immediate custody, ensuring that Izuku wouldn't have to worry about his past any longer. He resolved to make a few calls on their way home. He nodded, his face still pressed against my shoulder. I patted his back, and we remained like that for a few minutes before continuing to pack the most important items in his hideout. I suggested we return the next day to retrieve everything else, but he simply shook his head, a grin on his face. All he said was that he knew a guy. I sighed but didn't press him for further details. We gathered all the bags we had packed and headed for the car. Once everything was loaded, I double-checked to ensure we had everything. As Izuku climbed into the car, I went through the list in my mind. 3 duffel bags, check. A bag of unknown and potentially dangerous chemicals, check. A bag of various types of bombs, check. And the kid's computer and padlocks, check. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I turned to Izuku, who was now mentally and physically exhausted from earlier. He was fighting off sleep but was losing the battle. A small smile crept onto my face as I thought of the snarky kid. It was cold outside, and the car windows had fogged at the edges. It would still be about half an hour before we arrived home, and I sighed. I had just gotten off the phone with the chief, who was pleased to inform me that I now had temporary custody of Izuku while he worked with a social worker on the adoption process. As soon as we left the kid's old apartment, I called Nezu to inform him that the chief would be taking over the legal adoption process. He wasn't very pleased with the news. Glancing in the rearview mirror to check on Izuku, I found him peacefully asleep, having lost his battle with fatigue as soon as we started driving. I chuckled softly. The kid was out like a light. I turned my attention to the ridiculous amount of traffic outside. Fortunately, it only took a few minutes before we started moving again. Other than the light sound of the radio playing in the background and the soft snores of the sleeping kid, the drive was otherwise quiet. Suddenly, A buzzing sound interrupted the silence a few minutes before we reached our destination. A quick glance in the rearview mirror revealed Izuku's face pinching in irritation. He opened his eyes not long after, yawning and rubbing at his eyes, still looking tired. He mentioned that my device had been buzzing for a while and that he would have preferred to sleep a little longer, but since we would be there soon, it was probably best not to go back to sleep. He looked up at me, confused, but then nodded. The kid began fiddling with the small tech screen attached to his arm. I smiled at the sight before raising an eyebrow and shaking my head fondly. I asked if he was putting out another bounty. The kid froze, his head shooting up to look at me with a sheepish expression, clearly guilty. He admitted that I was right and let out a nervous chuckle. While I didn't fully agree with how he chose to handle the situation, I couldn't scold him for it, as it wasn't the worst decision he could have made. I asked about his progress, catching him off guard. He choked on air before managing to stammer a response. As I parked the car in our assigned space, I reiterated that while I didn't like how he dealt with the 8 bullets, they had it coming. From what the station had said, most of his allies were quite eager to get rid of them. Izuku huffed, stating that was an understatement. They wanted them all dead. However, he only wanted them captured to face their charges, believing that killing them would mean they got off easy for their crimes. He rummaged through the duffel bag next to him and pulled out a file he definitely shouldn't have, handing it to me. He explained that it was technically classified information from the Hero Commission's database and suggested I give it to the chief. I blinked in disbelief, deciding that today had already been chaotic, so what was one more illegal document? I asked if he always had such files on hand, and he shrugged. I rubbed a hand down my face, realizing this kid was something else. I suggested we save any more vigilantism for tomorrow, as he clearly needed sleep. I instructed him to grab whatever he could carry, promising to return for anything he left behind. He nodded, and we made our way into the apartment I owned, which would now be Izuku's new home. As I walked into the detective's home, I initially thought I would feel overwhelmed. Instead, I felt surprisingly relaxed. The detective, however, seemed nervous enough for both of us, standing there as if waiting for me to judge everything. The front entrance was simple, with a coat rack and a small closet for shoes and umbrellas. Upon entering the living room, I could already tell it would be my favorite place. The gray couch looked well-loved and worn, and a wooden coffee table sat in the middle of the room, with circular rings stained into the dark wood from when the detective had either been too tired or forgotten to use a coaster. Piles of police files were scattered around, and a large television, a little dusty but otherwise clean, occupied one corner. Underneath the mounted TV was a long bookshelf. As I scanned the titles, one book caught my attention, Sherlock Holmes, A Study in Scarlet. I had always wanted to read the series but never had the time. I flipped the book around to read the back and felt excitement at the prospect of finally diving into it. The detective's voice suddenly interrupted my thoughts, inviting me to read it, mentioning it had been his favorite book as a child. I was so startled that I nearly jumped out of my skin. Turning around to face the detective, the protagonist felt their heart racing. It seemed they hadn't concealed their surprise well, as he quickly apologized, expressing his regret for startling them. He mumbled something about scaring the poor kid, but the protagonist chose not to comment. They shook their head, attempting to regain their composure, and explained that they usually didn't let their mind wander, especially in unfamiliar surroundings. Looking down at the book in their hands, they felt a twinge of guilt for touching his belongings. As they prepared to return the book, he stopped them, encouraging them to keep it since they had expressed a longing to read it for a while. The protagonist blinked in surprise, realizing they had spoken their thoughts aloud, and nodded, their ears turning red with embarrassment. They recognized the need to control their habit of mumbling. The detective gestured down the hall, leading the way. He pointed out that the door to the left was the bathroom, while their room was right there, and his room was farther down the hall. He advised them to knock if they needed anything. As he opened the bedroom door, the protagonist stepped inside and felt a wave of warmth and happiness wash over them. The room wasn't extravagant, but it was the little details that stirred emotions they had tried to suppress in 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐽's old apartment. Taking a deep breath, they looked around. A dark gray bed adorned with freshly washed black and gray sheets occupied one corner. Across the room stood a desk large enough for their old computer setup, which brought a smile of relief to their face. 2 medium-sized bookshelves lined one wall, accompanied by a closet. Noticing their approval, the detective stood a little taller, visibly relieved. The protagonist smiled up at him, expressing that he couldn't have done anything better. He leaned against the door frame, gratitude evident on his face, and mentioned that Sansa had wanted a theme for the room, but he thought it best to let them design it themselves. The protagonist nodded, their gaze landing on the closet door, a grin spreading across their face. The detective sighed beside them, prompting the protagonist's grin to widen. He warned them not to start any big projects without at least 8 hours of sleep and a stable adult supervising. The protagonist agreed, acknowledging the fairness of his advice. As he made his way out of the room, he urged them to get some sleep, joking that if they continued like this, people might think they were related to Eraser. This elicited a snort of amusement from the protagonist, who promised to try their best but made no guarantees. He smiled before disappearing down the hallway. Alone in their new room, the protagonist processed everything that had happened over the past few days. They were so lost in thought that they didn't notice the detective returning to the door. He almost forgot to welcome them home, and as he left, the door clicked shut softly behind him. Staring at the closed door, the protagonist felt tears welling in their eyes. They fought against the urge to cry, biting the inside of their mouth to regain control. Taking a shaky breath, they suddenly felt their quirk pulling them into a vision. Closing their eyes, they allowed the energy to flow through their body, focusing on one thought: didn't they have energy drinks in the fridge at 𝐒𝐮𝐬's old apartment? When their eyes opened again, they found themselves at a lonely street corner. Sighing, they anticipated the headache that would come from this experience. They glanced at an old street clock nearby, noting it was a little past noon. Their next step was to find a calendar or a cell phone to check the date. Spotting a rundown playground occupied by a few children and their parents, they walked over. 2 kids played on the swings while their tired-looking father occasionally glanced at his phone. He didn't notice the protagonist approaching, as they were invisible in this vision. Walking up to the man, the protagonist snatched his phone from his hands. As they did, his image began to blur, like a reflection disturbed by a stone thrown into a lake. After a moment, they felt the weight of the cell phone in their palm. As had happened before, they walked away, glancing back to see the man's image return to normal, oblivious to what had just occurred. Moving in a random direction, the protagonist focused on hacking into the man's phone, which was more like a copy of it. Their thoughts drifted to the first time they had copied something during a vision, chuckling at the memory of trying to grab a bag of chips from a corner store because 𝐒𝐮𝐬 had forgotten to leave enough money for food. They had been so surprised when they finally managed to grab it that they dropped it by accident, only for disbelief to skyrocket when the character looked at the bag in their hands and back at the shelf. The shelf still had the same amount of chips as before. This was, of course, followed by many other experiments. They wondered if anything could be brought back when the quirk was turned off, and the answer was yes. They also questioned if there was a limit to how much could be copied, and again the answer was yes. Their thoughts were interrupted when a fire truck sped down the street. It was then that they took a moment to observe their surroundings. They had wandered into a nicer part of the city, where large houses, bustling malls, and busy restaurants filled the area. After walking for a bit, they spotted a bench and sat down, continuing to hack into a phone. A grin spread across their face as they realized they were nearing the final steps of the process when 2 elderly men sat next to them. Initially, they intended to ignore the men's conversation, but something they said piqued their interest. One of the men mentioned that the fire truck must be headed toward a forest fire, speculating whether the flame hero lived in that area and if he was the cause of the fire. Intrigued, the character listened as the other man expressed concern for the hero's children, noting that Endeavor was known for his short temper. Their eyes widened in disbelief as they considered their luck. Looking down at the now jailbroken phone, excitement and adrenaline surged through them as they noticed the date. It was late December. In the year. There was no way this could be true. They quickly shifted their attention from the stolen phone to their tech screen, searching through saved police files for one specific case. A mischievous grin spread across their face, one that even the hero killer stain would have envied. Just as they suspected, today was the date of death for none other than Todoroki Tuya. The case file indicated that it was closed, with the date of death listed as December 21st. The cause was a quirk accident, as the victim had possessed a fire-related quirk and was suspected of losing control of his flames. Detectives on the scene estimated the time of death to be between 5:30 p.m. and 7 p.m. Standing in front of the bench, adrenaline coursing through their veins, everything else blurred as they read over the file, eventually switching to another less questionable one. Taking a deep breath to calm their thoughts, they looked up from the screen, eyes wild with excitement. A thought struck them. Closing their eyes in focus, they realized that if the fire trucks had already passed, it was too late to gather any information. So, they did the only thing they could do. They focused and attempted something they weren't entirely sure was possible. They felt their power swirling around them like an angry tornado, draining their energy at an alarming rate, but they pressed on. Opening their eyes, they remained focused on their task, catching a glimpse of the darkened sky. A quick glance revealed the elderly men leaving in the same direction, causing a pang of disappointment to hit deep in their chest. It wasn't working. Shaking their head, they closed their eyes tightly, reminding themselves that this family trusted them to find out what happened to their loved one. A strong wave of freezing cold air burst from them, causing their quirk to flicker momentarily, nearly knocking them off their feet. It took a moment to steady themselves, but when they opened their eyes again, a smile broke across their face. Pulling out the older phone, they looked at the date once more. It read December 20th. They grinned, having finally managed to control their quirk enough to reverse the vision a day before. Perfect, the day before Tuya Todoroki's death. A strong gust of wind blew through their hair as they looked up, eyes closed, taking a deep breath of the cold, fresh air. When they opened their eyes, they took in the sight of the sky, painted in shades of orange and yellow as the day progressed. Shifting their attention from the horizon to the clearing of dense green trees, they realized they were looking at the exact spot that would lead them to the Todoroki family home. Their body was beyond tired, but they pushed through it. Looking back at the bench, they were surprised to see both old men still sitting there, perhaps regulars at the spot. They shrugged it off, turning their full attention to the trees off to the side. With their head tilted down and eyes narrowed, they ran into the forest, fully determined to solve the case and bring peace of mind to the family. With adrenaline coursing through their body, fueled by the thought of solving a case long forgotten, they continued. Jumping over large rocks, navigating fallen trees, and climbing up tall trunks for a better view was exhilarating, far easier than parkour in the city. The sun shone brightly, and the forest was alive and vibrant. A brown rabbit hopped out of the tall grass, nibbling on berries from a nearby bush. A wave of sadness washed over them. As they thought about the animals that would likely perish in the fire that would spread the next day, they exhaled, shoulders slumped but eyes focused. There was nothing they could do about it. And so, they ran through the trees as the sun began to set. Climbing another tree, they spotted a large house designed in a traditional Japanese style. They huffed, a cloud of cold air escaping through their nose and mouth. Instead of climbing down, they opted to jump off the branch they were standing on. Laughter escaped as the thrill of gravity took hold, and the sight below would have surely startled my new dad. As I fell, the vibrant swirls of blue and green surrounded me. A sudden gust of freezing air broke my descent, and I landed safely on the moist forest floor. Without losing momentum, I sprinted toward the Todoroki home, excitement bubbling within me. Upon reaching the seemingly ordinary house, I approached the plain gate. As I walked through it, it flickered momentarily before returning to its original state. Standing before the door, I scanned my surroundings, searching for something specific. After a brief search, I spotted the security cameras glinting in the fading sunlight. A grin spread across my face as I retrieved my handy hacking device. Within minutes, I accessed all the house's cameras. 2 in the driveway, 1 facing the front yard, 2 directed at the entrance, and another inside the courtyard. Determined to minimize the use of my quirk, I decided to pick the lock and enter without further assistance. Once inside, I ensured the door flickered back into place, as if I had never been there. I began to explore, placing my own cameras throughout the house. Though it felt strange to be in someone else's home, I continued my investigation while the family went about their lives, occasionally walking right through me. My final destination was the training room, a place I had heard about from the previous Todoroki children. It was a harsh environment, and I witnessed firsthand the grueling nature of Endeavor's training. He set impossibly high goals and expectations, and it was evident that the oldest Todoroki child was slowly losing his grip. With each blow and dodge, my stomach churned. Unable to bear it any longer, I stepped outside for fresh air, but my resolve only strengthened. I made my way to the location rumored to be where the oldest child had met his tragic fate, placing another camera there before retrieving the others I had set up in the house. I felt confident that I had gathered enough evidence to hold Endeavor accountable, at least temporarily. Returning to the house, I collected all the cameras except for the one hidden in the woods. I moved a good distance away and gazed back at the Todoroki household. A flash of blue caught my attention, and I quickly turned toward the light, sprinting into the darkness. What I found was unexpected. There in the forest was Tuya, drenched in sweat and breathing heavily. He was talking to himself, frustration evident in his demeanor. He urged himself to push harder, flames dancing in his hands and around his chest. I realized then why he had perished in the woods that day. He was likely training and lost control. But what was that blue light? Just then, he stopped yelling, and my eyes widened in disbelief. For a brief moment, his flames turned blue before vanishing just as quickly. Frustrated, he stormed off, and a single thought echoed in my mind, Dabi. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. At that moment, exhaustion from my quirk hit me like a ton of bricks. My body felt heavy, and I collapsed to the ground, turning off my quirk. There I lay, tired, cold, and alone once more. My breath quickened as panic set in, and I knew I needed to calm down and think. A knock at the door startled me, flooding my mind with questions. Who was it? Had someone broken in? Struggling to sit up, my arms and legs protested the movement. The doorknob twisted, and a worried voice reached my ears. Had they been calling out to me all this time? Where was I again? I looked around the room, realizing it was not my old room in Inko's apartment. My thoughts raced, but then I remembered I wasn't alone. The detective was here, wanting to adopt me. Relax, Izuku, relax, he urged. I took a few deep breaths, slowly regaining my composure. I hadn't even noticed that the detective had sat on the floor beside me, guiding me through a breathing exercise. His voice became clearer, and I finally returned to my senses. He helped me settle onto my bed, ensuring I was okay before asking a question. We're going to discuss this more later, but first, Izuku, did you send someone to retrieve your belongings from the old apartment and bring them here? Surprised by his question, I blinked and recalled something. A guilty expression crossed my face as I sighed. I had thought they would be in and out quickly, instructing them to remain unseen. Clearly, they needed more stealth training. Naomasa woke to the sound of something dropping and two hushed voices conversing. He jumped out of bed, grabbing his gun and clicking off the safety as he moved quietly into the living room, his police training guiding his steps. As he passed Izuku's room, he felt a sense of urgency. Panic coursed through my body from my toes to the top of my head. Was he all right? The door was closed, and a chill breeze seeped from beneath it. That brought me a little relief. It meant he was still inside his room, hopefully sleeping. With my gun raised and pointed forward, I pressed my back against the hallway wall. As I entered the living room, I spotted two men, likely in their mid-20s, standing there, carrying boxes and stacking them neatly. My instincts kicked in. If these individuals were dangerous, they posed a threat not just to me but also to my child. I shouted for them to raise their hands. They dropped what they were doing and froze. I ordered them to get on the ground and keep their hands where I could see them. Anger bubbled within me. Their presence had forced me to yell and risk waking Izuku, if he was even asleep. The two men complied, and I approached them to handcuff them both. As I pulled them up, I noticed they were wearing face masks that obscured more than half of their faces. My mind raced with thoughts of burglars, but that notion shifted when I spotted a familiar-looking smoke bomb among the boxes. My shoulders slumped as I took a deep breath. I asked what they were doing there. They hesitated before one of them finally spoke, nervously admitting they were there to drop something off on their boss's orders. The other chimed in, confirming they couldn't say anything more. I sighed, deciding it was worth the risk to mention Izuku's Vigilante name. I stated that Kaizen had sent them, and their terrified expressions confirmed my suspicion. Before they could respond, I left the room and headed to my child's room. I knocked gently and waited, but when I received no response, worry crept in. I called out to him, but there was still no answer. My gaze fell on the doorknob and I froze. It was frosted over. I grasped it and tried to turn it. Panic surged within me, and with strength I didn't know I possessed, I forced the door open. Upon entering the room, I was momentarily frozen. The entire space was covered in frost, ice coating everything, and icicles hung from the windowsill. I rushed to my child, who sat on the floor surrounded by ice. He wasn't shivering as much as one would expect, but he was still shaking. As I sat in front of him, realized he was in the early stages of a panic attack. I stayed by his side, guiding him through breathing exercises and placing his hand on my chest so he could feel my heartbeat. After about 15 minutes, he finally regained his composure. Once I had fussed over him for a few moments, I remembered the two strangers in the living room. I informed him we would discuss that later and asked if he had sent someone to retrieve his belongings from the old apartment. He went still, looking up at me like a guilty child. I smiled and shook my head, and he apologized, explaining he thought they would be in and out quickly and had instructed them to remain unseen. He then asked for his vigilante mask and a smoke bomb, and I agreed on the condition that he would return to sleep afterward. He quickly consented, and we made our way back to the living room. The kid threw the smoke bomb, and the room filled with smoke. I didn't need to see their faces to know both men turned pale. Izuku walked through the smoke and disappeared into another room. Moments later, Kaizen's disoriented voice echoed through the haze, instructing them to drop off whatever else he had requested before they could leave. The men hastily placed their unlocked 𝐒𝐮𝐬 on the ground, and without needing to be told twice, they vanished in an instant. It was only when one of the brothers used their teleportation quirk to escape that Izuku removed his mask and collapsed face-first onto the couch. I rushed to the window and opened it to help clear the smoke. I explained to him that those two were the Tsukauchi brothers, whom I called when I needed things moved quickly and quietly. One had a box quirk, and the other had a teleportation quirk. I nodded, storing that information for later. I then asked if he wanted to discuss why his room resembled a winter wonderland. He simply shook his head and revealed he had received a vision. He couldn't turn down the opportunity, stating that Todoroki Tuya was alive and hiding behind the alias villain Dabi. His head fell back onto the cushion, and his eyes grew heavy, as if he hadn't just shared concerning news. He asked if he could sleep there for the night, his words slurring as he spoke. I chuckled and headed into the hallway to grab some blankets. By the time I returned, he was already half asleep. I decided we could both camp out in the living room that night. He mumbled a thank you, and I shook my head fondly, laying down on the other couch across from him. I wasn't entirely comfortable leaving him alone after the panic attack earlier. Izuku lay there, feeling more relaxed and comfortable than he had in a long time. Never before had someone helped him through the beginning stages of a panic attack, but now he felt safe at home with the detective. His eyelids grew heavy, and a yawn escaped him. His mind drifted back to the events of his vision. It felt like he had been gone for 24 hours, but a quick glance at the clock revealed it had only been 2. He allowed himself to sink deeper into unconsciousness, believing he had done everything right. Finally, he surrendered to sleep. But what would later become clear was that something important had been overlooked, something that could have saved a lot of trouble down the line. The two elderly men, who had been chatting amiably just moments before, suddenly fell silent. They were likely retired, spending their weekends at home, eagerly awaiting phone calls from grandchildren that never came. However, on that cold December 20th, something unusual occurred. One of the men, George, remarked on a boy he thought he had seen standing a little way in front of them. The other man nodded in confusion, recalling the same sight. They both agreed that the boy had vanished without a trace, leaving them to wonder if they had imagined the green and black-haired child. They continued their discussion about the mysterious boy for a few hours before finally concluding that they must have been seeing things, given their less-than-perfect vision. George lingered a bit longer than usual, and after a few moments, he sighed and picked up his cane. He began to make his way home but couldn't resist turning back to the spot where the boy had disappeared. He felt certain he had seen the child there, clear as day. Meanwhile, Izuku had gathered all the information he needed to confront Endeavor, and Dabi was about to become Kaizen's #1 fan. In this chapter, it was revealed that Izuku himself was unaware of just how powerful his quirk truly was. Even without knowing the full extent of his abilities, he had created a formidable enigma of a vigilante in Kaizen. One could only imagine what he might achieve if he were at full power. 𝐒𝐬 was jolted awake by the sound of a ringing phone. He instinctively reached out to answer it, only to find his hand hitting the coffee table instead of the nightstand. As he shook off the remnants of sleep, he recalled the events of the past few days. His gaze shifted to the other sofa in the living room, where a lump wrapped in blankets lay sleeping. The child had cocooned himself comfortably, with only his sleepy face visible. A sigh of relief escaped 𝐒𝐬. He had worried the boy might fall off the couch, hence the pillows placed on the floor nearby. In his moment of concern, he had forgotten the reason he had gotten up in the first place. The phone rang again, louder this time, prompting him to sprint to his bedroom to silence it before it disturbed the sleeping child. In seconds, he had the phone in hand and glanced at the time, resisting the urge to scoff at the early hour. He answered without checking the caller ID, wondering who would call at 6:30 a.m. "Detective 𝐒𝐬 Tsukauchi speaking," he stated. The voice on the other end made him instantly regret not checking the caller ID. It was Nezu, who greeted him cheerfully and remarked on the lovely day outside, claiming he hoped he hadn't woken 𝐒𝐬. The sound of teacups clinking and manic laughter followed. Nezu continued, suggesting it was fitting to disrupt 𝐒𝐬's sleep since he had done the same days prior. 𝐒𝐬 resisted the urge to hang up. He replied that it was indeed early in the morning, though he was lying through his teeth. After a brief silence, Nezu bluntly stated that he wanted Kaizen to attend you. Hi, whether in the near future or that school year. He offered a formal apology if his previous comments had offended 𝐒𝐬. Irritation flickered in 𝐒𝐬's eyes at Nezu's words, but he forced himself to remain calm. He explained that Kaizen was not yet old enough to attend you. Having just turned, Nezu hummed thoughtfully before typing could be heard on his end. He acknowledged 𝐒𝐬's point, revealing he was looking at Kaizen's legal file, which he had previously been unable to access. A grin spread across 𝐒𝐬's face. Izuku had mentioned he would dismantle the defenses on his government files. It seemed the station wasn't the only entity unable to break the boy's codes. Nezu's laughter grew, becoming almost manic as he expressed his longing to have Kaizen as a student, noting that the boy had recently advanced a grade. Although there were numerous accusations on his school files, Nezu assured 𝐒𝐬 that those could easily be covered up with a few calls to the right people. 𝐒𝐬 felt a sense of unease as he walked out of his room, heading toward his office past Izuku's strangely frozen room. He paused at the doorway, baffled by the sight of the completely frosted-over space. What surprised him most was the absence of water. Not a single drip or puddle was present. He stared at the large icicles hanging from the windowsill, his mouth slightly agape. Shaking his head, he decided it was too early for this. Just then, Nezu's voice broke through his thoughts, reminding him that he was still on the line. 𝐒𝐬 jumped, having almost forgotten about the call. His body tensed at Nezu's words, and he braced himself for whatever warning was coming next. The urgency of the message received that morning weighed heavily on Nezu's mind. After some investigation, he discovered it was from Hawks, the number 3 hero. Alarm bells rang in his ears as he deciphered the underlying message. The Commission had grown weary of Kaizen's antics and had sent their most formidable threat. Nezu ran a hand through his hair, staring blankly out the window of his home office. He resolved to speak with Izuku when he woke up to see if he had any additional information. Just as he was about to end the call, the mouse bear spoke again, expressing concern for Kaizen's safety. Nezu understood the gravity of the situation. Hawks was not an opponent to be taken lightly. While he had no doubts about Kaizen's abilities, he acknowledged the need for caution. The call ended, leaving Nezu deep in thought. He expected to feel hesitant or doubtful, but instead he felt a sense of certainty. Raising Kaizen would undoubtedly be challenging, but he had already considered him his child for months. The boy had boldly declared that Nezu was the only one he would accept as his parent. Glancing through the open door of his office, Nezu saw Kaizen bundled up, the rise and fall of his breathing the only sign of life beneath the layers. He turned away, allowing himself a moment of gratitude. He picked up the gift Sansa had chosen for him during their trip to the mall. Curiosity piqued, he opened the plastic bag to reveal a book titled, How to Raise an Evil Genius, for Dummies. Meanwhile, Izuku was lost in a deep sleep, cocooned in a heavy blanket that enveloped him in warmth and safety. The sunlight filtering through the curtains stirred him awake, but he remained reluctant to leave his cozy nest. The enticing aroma wafting from the kitchen eventually coaxed him out of bed. Despite his grogginess, he navigated his way to the kitchen, a feat considering his past mishaps. Upon entering, he found his dad mixing ingredients in a bowl and cracking eggs with ease, occasionally glancing at a cookbook. Izuku decided it was time to announce his presence. The reaction was immediate. His dad jumped in surprise, knocking over a bowl and spilling its contents. Izuku quickly sprang into action, catching the bowl just in time, landing on the floor with a muffled declaration of success. He pushed himself up, rubbing his face as he placed the bowl back on the counter. His dad, concerned for his well-being, lifted him onto a chair in the dining room, asking if he was hurt. After reassuring him that he was fine, his dad returned to the kitchen, and Izuku followed closely behind, his hunger taking over. He snatched a banana from the fruit bowl while watching his dad prepare what he recognized as pancakes. His dad's voice broke through his thoughts, informing him that breakfast would be ready in about 10 to 15 minutes and suggesting he clean up. Izuku looked down at his Vigilante uniform, realizing it was dusty and stained from his recent encounter with a villain. He grimaced at the thought of the remnants of battle clinging to him. After a brief exchange about the importance of cleanliness, Izuku headed to his room, only to find everything frozen from the previous night's panic. With the help of his quirk, he quickly defrosted his belongings and rummaged through his duffel bag, selecting a simple t-shirt that read, "Too tired to care," and a pair of black cargo briefs with secret pockets. By the time he emerged from the shower, feeling refreshed, his dad was already seated at the table, waiting for him. As Izuku entered the kitchen, he clicked his gadgets into place, the familiar sounds filling the room. He ensured everything was secure before looking up at his dad, who stared at him in awe. I blinked owlishly at him, tilting my head in confusion. He shuddered and shook his head, indicating that we would discuss the amount of weaponry I carried later. For now, he encouraged me to eat, reminding me that I needed my vitamins to grow big and strong. I slid into the chair across from him, nodding uncertainly. Was I in trouble? What had I done wrong? I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the vision I had experienced the night before. I took a deep breath and stuffed my face with another delicious pancake that the detective had made. After a brief vision and several more mouthfuls of pancakes, I decided to share what I knew with my new guardian. The detective was loading dishes into the dishwasher when I spoke up, explaining that my room was a winter wonderland because I had received a strong vision the previous night. He turned to me, seemingly about to ask a question, but then gestured for me to continue. I described how, when I first entered a vision, all I could see was white, and then I would suddenly find myself in a completely different place. Last night, I had seen the exact year and day of Tuya Todoroki's supposed death. The detective listened intently as I listed the serious crimes committed by Endeavor, the number 2 hero, the illegal practice of a quirk marriage, child abuse, child endangerment, abuse of power, and domestic violence. I leaned into my vigilante role, feeling a surge of determination. I mentioned that I needed to retrieve some important evidence later that day. I watched as my guardian left the table and quickly returned with his work laptop, typing away as he began to build a case against Endeavor. I attached my own device to my arm and reviewed the files, my plan taking shape in my mind and visions. With a sigh, I looked at the only parental figure I had ever known and asked if I could take over the case, explaining that I had been plotting this for weeks. I expected some form of resistance, but instead, I received the one sentence I had always wanted to hear from an adult. He said he wouldn't let me do this alone and asked how he could help. Kaizen's perspective shifted as he observed the aftermath of the forest fire, realizing that seeing it only in pictures and reports had not done it justice. He was surprised by the growth. Everywhere he looked, there were trees. The forest had not completely burned down, which was a positive sign, but the new growth would make it more challenging to find what he sought. Standing firmly on a thick branch, he breathed in the fresh air, 100 feet above the ground. Below him, a tree that had survived the fire was still thriving 7 years later. He perked up at the sound of someone calling his name and glanced down to see someone standing at the base of the tree. With a grin, he leapt off the branch. As gravity pulled him down, he activated his quirk, his eyes shining blue for an instant, just enough time to ensure a safe landing. A freezing wave of air erupted from his body, allowing him to touch down silently. He opened his eyes, realizing he had closed them, and found himself facing a scruffy, tired-looking Eraserhead. Before Kaizen could speak, the underground hero remarked that Tsukauchi had sent him to keep up with my speed, but he wondered if it was really because he didn't want to witness the dangerous stunts I would pull. The deadpan voice and expression made it hard for Kaizen to suppress a snicker. Eraserhead then questioned how the detective had managed to get me there, noting that I looked half dead on my feet. More than usual, anyway. Kaizen huffed, giving Eraserhead his best unimpressed look before propelling himself forward without warning. This did not surprise the underground hero, who had years of experience as a top hero. Jumping over large rocks and fallen trees, weaving through dirt, bushes, and leaves, Kaizen couldn't help but smile. The detective had insisted I not enter the woods alone, aware that I could easily get lost. However, he also realized early on that he couldn't keep up with me, so he called in a favor, resulting in the grumpy hero currently chasing me around. Despite my thoughts, I didn't dislike Eraserhead. He was a good hero, my favorite in fact, but not always the best teacher, in my humble opinion. In all my visions, he seemed to give the students the bare minimum before falling asleep in his sleeping bag. Not the best guidance in my opinion, but I had to give him credit for his chaotic nature. Suddenly, I snapped back to reality as something came into view. About 15 feet away was a small cliff that dropped roughly 10 feet down. I launched myself off a particularly large and sharp rock, running full speed ahead, with Eraserhead not far behind. As the feeling of weightlessness overtook me and the trees below blurred my vision, my eyes remained focused and sharp. An excited yell escaped my lips as my stomach swirled, giving me the confidence to free fall off the cliff. A laugh bubbled up as I threw myself off. As I began to descend, gravity pulled me down. Cracking an eye open, I noticed Eraserhead right next to me, his capture scarf swirling around him. It snaked around my waist, and the underground hero guided me as we landed on the nearest tree. He touched down on the branch with ease, and I adjusted my body to land beside him. I turned my head upward, and he nodded as we began scaling the large tree, climbing like a pair of wild animals fueled by adrenaline. My thoughts drifted to the interactions that led to this hero becoming my favorite. I mostly remembered the most unhinged moments, like the time I saw him throw a purple-haired student out of his classroom. I mentioned this to him, noting that the student was fine, having stuck to a wall on the way down. It made me wonder why the underground hero acted that way. Could it have been Nezu's influence, or was he always like this? It was unfortunate that the principal had tainted my opinion of him with just a few words. Glancing at the hero, I decided to ask him directly. He seemed to dismiss my curiosity, telling me not to question his methods in front of a 13-year-old. I rolled my eyes, originally intending to list more examples of his eccentricities. Just then, my gaze caught a flash of silver, and my eyes gleamed with excitement. I jumped off, running toward the reflective object. However, I hadn't accounted for Eraserhead's capture weapon still attached to me. He couldn't keep up, and it nearly knocked the wind out of me. Before I felt it loosen, I seized the opportunity, grabbing the retreating end of the fabric and wrapping it around a thick tree. Eraserhead was far enough away that the fabric tightened like a bungee cord. I smirked at my makeshift trampoline, using it to propel myself high into the air, just enough to snatch the camera nestled in the leaves. Looking down at the familiar camera in my hands, the very one I had placed in the forest right before Toya Todoroki's incident, I felt a mix of pride and fear. I understood how crucial this information was and how it would impact not just the family that sent the request but everyone in Japan. Little did they realize their number 2 hero was about to be revealed in full, not just his hero persona but Enji Todoroki as well. I lifted the small camera into the air so Eraserhead could see our prize from the hunt. He narrowed his eyes at the camera before turning to me with a glare, thankfully one without his quirk activated. I grinned at him innocently, teasing him about looking a little out of breath. He glared back, clearly annoyed, and took the device from my hands to inspect it. He remarked that it didn't look dangerous, and I let my grin widen, shrugging casually. I explained that what he held in his hands could sell on the black market for 150 million yen, and that price would skyrocket once it was known I was the seller. People tended to trust me when it came to information, and for good reason. I watched as his expression shifted from boredom to uncertainty with each word I spoke. He gave me a blank look before gently placing the camera back into my hands. I turned my attention back to the forest ahead, contemplating the possibility of Eraser agreeing to race me back to the detective. A cold cloud of air seeped through my closed mouth, and my eyes turned blue, signaling an important vision, though not urgent enough to be deemed an emergency. I saw myself still in the forest as a bullet whizzed past my head, mere inches away from potentially harming me. Just as quickly as it appeared, the vision vanished. I gasped, leaning against the nearest tree for support, breathing in and out to fight off the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. Eraserhead noticed my sudden change in mood and looked at me with concern, placing a hand firmly on my shoulder. He asked if I was all right. I shook my head, pushing away from the tree to stand on my own. I informed him that we were not alone. His eyes narrowed, clearly picking up on my serious demeanor. He urged me to tell him what I had seen. I took a steady breath, calming my mind before explaining that someone had followed us into the forest with the objective to kill me. Their weapon of choice was a sniper, and while I wasn't entirely sure of the model, I had a hunch based on the sound alone that they were counting on the element of surprise. I sighed, my annoyance evident. We needed more information. Several seconds passed with my eyes shut, but I could feel the tension in the air as time ticked by. Once I was satisfied with my quick information gathering, I opened my eyes to see the underground hero perched in a tree. His capture weapon was now untangled and resting neatly on his shoulders again. It didn't take long for me to join him high in the air, having quietly scaled the tree next to him. Carefully, I forced my face to remain neutral as I looked out at the view ahead, potential plans already forming in my mind. A grin spread across my face despite my efforts to stay composed. A long, defeated sigh came from the left, only making the grin widen further. The thought of whether to inquire about it lingered for a moment before a tired shrug followed, hands slipping into the pockets of a dark coat. The yellow caterpillar man was engaged in a mental debate, his desperate murmurs almost eliciting laughter. He repeated to himself that he would not be an accomplice, his resolve wavering as he continued his rant. Leaning lazily against a tree, a wonderful and intriguing thought resurfaced. The words were drawn out casually, though anyone familiar with the speaker could sense mischief brewing. Eraser, one of those people, responded with the fervor of a strict teacher, firmly stating that he had agreed to keep the other out of trouble while they roamed the forest. So far, they had not crossed any lines, and he intended to keep it that way, insisting they head back to Tsukauchi. Unimpressed, the speaker looked up to meet Eraser's narrowed gaze, which suggested he believed he had won the argument. Turning on his heels, he began to walk away. The speaker, however, pointed out that they had already committed a few offenses. This caused the hero to pause, murmuring a quiet inquiry about what was meant by that, almost as if he didn't want to know the answer. With a face that radiated innocence, the speaker explained that they were trespassing and aiding a heavily wanted vigilante. The words flowed easily, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, before turning and walking deeper into the forest. As expected, a deep, tired sigh escaped the hero's lips, followed by the sound of footsteps trailing behind. They continued walking until they reached a small river. Once standing side by side, the speaker turned to Eraser with a serious expression, revealing that they were being watched by the Hero Commission, who were not there for a friendly visit. Additionally, there was an uninvited guest among them. Reaching into a pocket, the speaker retrieved a smoke bomb and handed it to Eraser, sitting down with hands clasped in front of their face, ready for whatever game the Hero Commission wanted to play. Glancing at the small but powerful camera in the left pocket, the speaker felt close to cracking the Todoroki case, the last piece of evidence weighing heavily in their pocket. Nothing was stopping them from initiating Phase 1. The question of what the plan was hung in the air, waiting for a response.